Good morning. Good morning, everyone. The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on 7 public lands bills. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Thank you. Thank you. In addition, due to the broad interest in today's hearing, I would like to ask unanimous consent that all interested members be allowed to join us and participate on the dais. Thank you all so much for attending this subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands legislative hearing on 7 public lands bills. I would like to extend my gratitude to the bill sponsors joining us today to testify. At the onset, I'd like to recognize the work of my fellow subcommittee members, Ms. DeGette and Mr. Huffman, in bringing forward strong bills for our consideration today. I would like to welcome our witnesses, many whom have traveled a long way to speak about the personal and national significance of these proposals. One of the first bipartisan actions taken by this Congress was to pass S-47, the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation, Management, and Recreation Act. That bill, now law, helped protect more than 2 million acres of public lands, including 287 miles as wild and scenic rivers and 1.2 million acres as wilderness nationwide. 250,000 of those wilderness acres are in my wonderful state of New Mexico, and were also included in my Antiquities Act, the first bill that I filed. The bills before us today propose designating more public land as part of our national wilderness preservation system. They would expand our national wild and scenic river system. They create new opportunities for a future generation of Americans to access and recreate on our public lands. And they help enhance connectivity to protect healthy habitats and respond to climate change. Now, I know some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have come prepared to oppose some concepts before us today, but I encourage all members to judge these bills and their merits not through ideological or partisan lenses. In 1964, Congress had the foresight to enact the Wilderness Act and followed up with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act shortly after 1968. But now more than ever, there is a desire and a need to protect our lands and waters in their natural condition. We know how protected public lands contribute to local economies and help grow our multi-billion-dollar recreation economy, but Congress's ability to permanently protect wild places for their untamed nature provides so much more. We can realize benefits ranging from protected watersheds that provide clean drinking water to millions of Americans to conserving intact natural systems that provide wildlife habitat and buffer against climate change. Some of these bills have been decades in the making, the product of grassroots engagement and stakeholder input. Others build on more recent gains or strive to be forward-thinking in addressing emerging challenges. While the bills before us are diverse in their purpose, they all provide opportunity for connection, recreation, and resilience. They recognize the importance of healthy natural environments to local communities and urban areas alike. They reach beyond county lines to provide places to reconnect with a system much larger than ourselves and acknowledge that some places simply cannot be improved upon by humans. And for all that debate that ensues in this committee about how we should manage our public lands, the reality is that we can't dismiss the urgent need to act. Around the world, wild places and the species that depend on them are disappearing at an alarming rate. As human-driven climate change increasingly impacts our natural world, permanently protecting public lands is one of the best ways to ensure these places continue to exist as we know them for the benefit of future generations. I would like to thank the sponsoring members for their leadership on these issues, and to the witnesses, thank you again for being here today. I look forward to hearing your testimony. I now recognize the ranking minority member, Mr. Curtis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As Chair Holland noted in her opening remarks, the subcommittee meets today to consider 7 pieces of legislation. These bills before us address over 2 million acres of land and over 800 miles of rivers. While I do not believe that all the bills before us reflect a balance, compromise, and local support to become law at this time, I hope this hearing can serve as a space to work towards solutions to improve these bills. I fear that this committee is bringing forward some bills that do not have the consensus that is necessary to move forward, including giving all impacted parties a seat at the table. I fear this could accidentally set back some of these bills years, if not decades, by preventing the dialogue necessary to find consensus among a broad group of stakeholders. However, there is some consensus legislation today, including H.R. 252, the Pershing County Economic Development and Conservation Act, offered by Mr. Amadei. This bill is the culmination of years of stakeholder outreach and reflects the type of bipartisan agreement that is possible when we stop playing politics and start listening to local voices. This bill has the support of the entire Nevada delegation, impacted communities, and affected stakeholder groups. I also appreciate the majority holding a hearing on H.R. 1475, offered by Mr. Stauber from Minnesota. This bill addresses specific concerns raised by the local recreation community in Mr. Stauber's district, including the reinstatement of a lottery system for the issuance of boat permits in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness of the Superior National Forest. The remaining 5 bills collectively create over 1.5 million acres of new wilderness, our country's most restrictive federal land designation. These designations must be carefully applied due to their limitations and make sure to take into account existing uses of the land that could be limited, including wildfire risk, public access challenges, and economic concerns raised by local stakeholders. I do not have enough time to address each of the individual concerns in the bills before us, but I will briefly highlight some of the more worrisome flaws that I believe need to be addressed before this committee considers additional action. H.R. 2546, offered by Congresswoman DeGette from Colorado, would create 741,000 acres of new wilderness located in 33 areas across the state. Much to my concern of all the new wilderness designated by this bill, much of this is designated outside of Ms. DeGette's districts without the support of the member of Congress who represents the vast majority of the impacted land. This bill is being openly opposed by many of the rural communities that would be impacted and lacks the bipartisan consensus necessary to get signed into law. Today we will hear testimony from Montezuma County commissioners outlining the county's specific grievances with this legislation. In addition, the impacted land management agencies have noted that this bill presents many challenges and is inconsistent with previous designations and existing land uses. Additionally, the National Guard Bureau has raised concerns about the bill's impact on high-altitude aviation training, or HAATS, located in Eagle, Colorado. They are concerned that this bill will jeopardize the specialty helicopter training that takes place in eastern Garfield County. It seems that this bill has many issues to be resolved before it's ready to be heard by this committee. Another bill I'd like to bring to attention to is H.R. 2250, offered by Congressman Huffman of California. This legislation would create over 262,000 acres of new wilderness and 370 miles of new wilderness and scenic rivers. We will hear testimony today from Keith Groves, who is a member of the Trinity County Board of Supervisors. Mr. Groves County contains 95% of the lands that would be designated as wilderness under Mr. Huffman's proposal, including much of the land that would be moved into the proposed restoration area. Trinity County has expressed confusion and concern with many of the bill's provisions. I would encourage Mr. Huffman to continue to engage with Trinity County and other impacted communities to clarify points of confusion and concern before any further action on this legislation. This consensus is vital when we are impacting such large areas of public land. As I have articulated in this committee many times, and as much of my own public land legislation work has demonstrated, I am not opposed to wilderness designation where appropriate. I've championed over 600,000 acres of wilderness that has signed into law just last year. However, I believe that advancing unbalanced bills like some of those before us is an unproductive endeavor that may garner points with certain special interest groups, but ultimately works only to further prevent real progress through compromise. Land management policies affect numerous interests. Compromise in this space is often difficult to achieve, but I encourage all my friends to pursue it in this long run. It will prove to be a worthy endeavor. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield my time.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Curtis. Now I'd like to turn to our first panel and welcome the members of Congress who wish to testify on the bills they have sponsored. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you choose. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left and red when time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Chair Holland and Ranking Member Curtis, for holding this hearing. I'm proud to testify today in support of my bill, H.R. 2642, the Wild Olympics and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 2019. I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest on the Olympic Peninsula in the district that I now am honored to represent. So I know firsthand how special this area is. Everyone who visits leaves with a memory they won't soon forget. Whether you're spending time hiking through the Hoh Rainforest or paddling down the Elwha River, a trip to our region stays with you. There's something special about our woods and our waters. You realize it when you're out there with the people you care about. For me, Olympic National Park wasn't just a place where my family could pile into the car for some camping. It's part of the fabric of who we are. In fact, my grandfather even helped pave a portion of the road up Hurricane Ridge, which my father told us every time we went up Hurricane Ridge. But for folks like my grandfather and countless others, the great outdoors is a key driver of our local economies. It's given opportunities to entrepreneurs who started restaurants in Grays Harbor, or companies in Clallam County offering guided tours, or small business owners who run hotels for visitors to stay near the park, or even for road paving crews. Each year, millions of people and families travel to my state and contribute roughly $22 billion in economic impact and support 200,000 jobs in our outdoor economy. So, for the region I represent, protecting public lands isn't just about saving these unforgettable places for future generations. It also means protecting high-quality jobs for the next generation as well. And that's why I'm proud to sponsor H.R. 2642, the Wild Olympics and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 2019. This bill will create a new wilderness area encompassing 126,000 acres of old-growth and mature forest habitat in the Olympic National Forest, and designate 464 river miles across 19 rivers and major tributaries on the Olympic Peninsula as wild and scenic rivers. Since its inception, which began with my predecessor Norm Dix, this proposal has evolved through extensive public engagement with tribes, conservation groups, timber communities, business leaders, shellfish growers, and everyone in between to create a bill that works for our local communities. It's because of that extensive public outreach that this bill is now formally supported by more than 800 community leaders, Republicans, Democrats, business owners, sportsmen, mayors, county commissioners, and tribal leaders, who all agree that this proposal moves our region in the right direction. In addition to protecting recreational access and supporting our outdoor economy, this bill will also bolster our region's efforts to protect sources of clean drinking water, support critical salmon and steelhead habitat, and protect key waterways that are vital to the shellfish industry. But just as important are all the things that this bill will not do. This bill will not close, decommission, or otherwise restrict access to any existing Forest Service roads or trailheads. It will not impact any harvestable timber base in the Olympic National Forest, and it will not affect any private property rights. It is truly a win-win for the region I represent. And while this proposal undoubtedly moves our region forward, both ecologically and economically, I know that there are many folks who would also like to see more actions taken to responsibly increase harvest levels on the Olympic National Forest. And I want to state unequivocally that I remain strongly committed to that effort as well. That's why we've worked to establish and support the Olympic Forest Collaborative, which has successfully brought stakeholders in our region together to implement novel forest treatments that are increasing harvest levels and improving forest health. I know we have more work to do to ensure the timber industry remains a successful part of our region's economy, but as someone who spent a decade working professionally in economic development, I know that our region's future depends on building a strong and diversified economy, because a one-legged economic stool doesn't stand, no matter how hard we try. And that's why this bill is so important. So again, I want to thank you, Chair Holland, Ranking Member Curtis, and all the subcommittee members for holding this important hearing. And I also want to thank my good friend and constituent, Roy Knott, for traveling all the way from the better Washington to testify in favor of this bill. And with that, I want to say thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kilmer. And realizing how busy all of your schedules are, if you're welcome to get on with your day after your testimony if you would like to. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from California, Ms. Chu.
Thank you, Chair Holland, Ranking Member Curtis, and members of the subcommittee for holding this important hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about my bill, H.R. 2215, the San Gabriel Mountains, Foothills, and Rivers Protection Act, and why it is so important to members of my community in the San Gabriel Valley and throughout Southern California. The San Gabriel Mountains provide 30% of Southern California's water, comprise 70% of Los Angeles County's open space, and are home to historic habitats of species like the California condor and the Nelson bighorn sheep. This legislation is the result of decades of advocacy and grassroots efforts to bring more resources and stronger protections to these mountains and the communities that serve as their gateway. In 2014, all our hard work was recognized by President Obama, who designated the San Gabriel Mountains a national monument, immediately bringing new federal funding and resources to the mountains. This designation resulted in the hiring of more staff, extensive cleanup and graffiti removal, and leveraged millions of dollars in private philanthropy. This was a momentous success for the mountains and our communities, but there's still so much more that needs to be done. My legislation, which has also been introduced in the Senate by Senator Kamala Harris, would build on the successes of President Obama's declaration by expanding the national monument to include the Western Angeles National Forest, establishing new and expanded wilderness areas, and protecting more than 45 miles of waterways by designating them as wild and scenic rivers. This bill would also establish a new San Gabriel Mountains National Recreation Area that would bolster the critical connection between urban and wild places, helping the communities in the foothills and along the river corridor to improve access to the mountains and provide new recreation opportunities for Angelinos. And that is so important to the Los Angeles region, which is amongst the most park poor in the nation. In fact, Los Angeles County has just 3.3 acres of park space per 1,000 people, which is less than half the median green space in other dense cities. And access to parks and public space has real tangible benefits for public health and well-being in our communities. Studies show that having access to parks and green spaces leads to an increase in physical activity of almost 50%. And with more than 15 million people living within a 90-minute drive of the San Gabriel Mountains, investing in their protection and access will pay enormous dividends. My bill represents the next step in protecting and connecting the San Gabriels, and it's shaped by years of tireless community engagement. In 2003, former representative and current Los Angeles County Supervisor Hilda Solis successfully advocated for Congress to authorize the National Park Service to undertake a special resource study of the San Gabriel River watershed to determine whether the area should be incorporated into the national park system. That decade-long study found that the area would benefit from such an inclusion. In response, our local governments, water agencies, nonprofit organizations, environmental advocates, recreation groups, businesses, firefighters, and many other stakeholders came together to back this plan and advocate for measures to make it better. This legislation reflected their priorities and includes language to guarantee that local water rights are preserved, private property is protected, local control rests with cities, and fire management is prioritized. Since the designation of the National Monument, we've seen our rivers cleaned up, our picnic areas cleaned of trash, increased access to trails that are safer and better marked, more rangers interacting with visitors, and most importantly, our entire community is at the table developing the management plan for our San Gabriel Mountains. In fact, the best thing to happen since the designation was the creation of the Community Collaborative, which consists of over 40 members representing a variety of stakeholders such as waters, cities, and businesses. This collaborative has led to greater public input with what happens in our mountains, and we are much better for it. So thank you for recognizing these priorities by holding this legislative hearing, and I look forward to the committee's continued consideration of this important legislation.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Chair Holland and Ranking Member Curtis, for this opportunity to testify before this important subcommittee in support of my legislation, H.R. 2199, the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act. I also want to take an opportunity to thank my constituent, Graciela Cabello, who is sitting behind me, who traveled from Santa Barbara, California, to be here today to discuss the community's support for this legislation. She will be speaking later. I am humbled to represent the Central Coast of California, one of the most beautiful districts in the nation. It encompasses the entirety of Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo counties, as well as a portion of Ventura County. It includes hidden treasures like the Channel Islands National Park, the Marine Sanctuary, the Los Padres National Forest, and the Carrizo Plain National Monument. They contain some of the most stunning and diverse ecosystems found anywhere in North America. The Los Padres National Forest provides habitat for some 468 species of wildlife, including the endangered California condor and the southern steelhead. The California Plains National Monument contains one of the highest concentrations of protected species in the lower 48 states and is home to incredible plant and animal life, such as the majestic Tule elk. These public lands protect an invaluable watershed, providing much-needed water resources for nearby communities. H.R. 2199, the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act, would designate nearly 250,000 acres of public land within the Los Padres National Forest and the Carrizo Plain National Monument as wilderness areas. It also creates a 400-mile-long Condor National Recreation Trail, stretching from Los Angeles to Monterey County. As many of you know, a wilderness designation is one of the highest forms of protection we can provide as policymakers for public lands. This would protect the ecological beauty, the abundant natural resources, and recreational activities available to communities in my district and beyond. We know that our nation's public lands are a cherished aspect of our outdoor heritage. They are an essential asset to our local tourism economy. In fact, in California, the outdoor recreation economy is worth about $92 billion and employs over 650,000 individuals. In 2017, the Carrizo Plain, often referred to as the California Serengeti, made international headlines due to its spectacular super bloom. The Bureau of Land Management logged a record number of 14,000 visitors in April 2017 due to this phenomenon. Protecting our public lands and outdoor economy is especially important as the current administration continues to take action to open up public lands and national monuments to oil interests. Just last year, the Bureau of Land Management approved a new oil well and pipeline inside the Carrizo Plain National Monument. Most recently, the Bureau of Land Management proposed a plan for increased oil and gas lease sales on 1.6 million acres of land within the area. As policymakers, we have a responsibility to protect these special places for future generations. Holding this hearing on the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act is a step in the right direction. I will work with my colleagues and continue fighting to protect our open spaces. We must push this measure across the finish line. Thank you again for the opportunity to support my legislation, H.R. 2199. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carvajal. And the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Amodei.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to be part of your record here regarding the consideration of H.R. 252. Initially, I would like to, through the process, your process of unanimous consent, ask that a letter that I am offering dated July 8th, 2019, from the Pershing County Board of Commissioners be included within your record on the matter of H.R. 252 today.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To you and to the ranking member, it's a privilege to be here again. This is not the first time that this committee has considered this piece of legislation. In the last Congress, it was passed under unanimous consent out of this committee, went to the floor of the House, and passed by voice vote under the suspension calendar. I will not speculate for you what happened in the Senate because, quite frankly, I'm not cool enough to know what goes on over there, so let's just say we'd like to give them another opportunity to agree with this committee and its prior actions. I'm going to just summarize it briefly for you and then maybe anticipate a couple of the concerns that came up from the Department of Interior last year. Quite frankly, Pershing County is one of those counties in Nevada which you may know as the home to the Burning Man event, which is held in the western part of Pershing County. This bill does nothing to affect the Burning Man event, so please relax, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a backdoor run for that sort of thing. The county is over 90% federally owned. This authorizes potentially up to 300,000 acres of checkerboard land along the old Transcontinental Railroad to be consolidated for potential sale. That represents about 11% of the federal holdings in the county. But I want to point out a fact that's fairly salient to this, and that is the authorization of land for sale via federal lands bills in Nevada does not mean the land gets sold. I would call your attention to the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act, which turned 20 last year, one of the most successful pieces of public lands legislation in the history of the nation, authorized 70,000 acres in Clark County, known to many of you as the home of Las Vegas, to be sold. In the 20 years, approximately half of that was sold in one of the most active financial real estate markets in the country, an average of 1,700 acres a year in one of the most active real estate markets in the Southwest. In many of these acts, we've had to go back through this committee and amend the expiration dates because, quite frankly, the land hasn't sold. What it represents is an opportunity for local planning and zoning folks to use a tool when they decide what their responsible economic growth is for future planning and zoning purposes. You should know that not only does the Pershing County Board of Commissioners support it by virtue of the letter in your record, which is the primary planning and zoning authority for the county, but also you have Friends of Nevada Wilderness, several mining companies, Pew Charitable Trust, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and Coalition for Nevada's Wildlife in support, which is part of the reason this bill has previously enjoyed strong support from this committee in terms of whether or not to send it to the floor with a favorable recommendation. There have been concerns expressed in the Senate hearing, I believe, in the last Congress by the Department of Interior regarding access if you deal with checkerboard issues in this. I would point out that there is specific language in the bill itself that talks about not cutting people off from access, so I'm not sure what the basis of that is. Also, I would also indicate that quite frankly, when I hear of this, unless something's changed, you have no indication from the field office manager, the district manager, or the state director of the Bureau of Land Management providing you with specific reasons why there's a problem. So quite frankly, if it's okay with you, Madam Chair, I would like to stick around and listen to what the Department of Interior has to say about the bill a couple of years later after those concerns have been specifically included within the language that deals with it in a way that I think is quite favorable to all concerned. And with that, Madam Chair, unless there are questions for me, I would yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amadei. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Chairwoman Holland and Ranking Member Curtis, for allowing me the opportunity to testify in H.R. 1475, the Lottery Act. Although the economy in Minnesota's 8th district is dominated by the reliant development of resources like mining and timber, these industries exist in harmony with tourism. One of the national forests in my district contains the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, a wilderness known for multiple use and recreation. Let me begin with a little background. Let's say you and your family would like to come to northern Minnesota for a weekend of fishing walleye on Moose or Basswood Lake, two of the prominent lakes within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. You would call an outfitter in the area registered with our local Forest Service as a cooperator to set you up with a permit to operate a small motorized boat on that lake ahead of time. The BWCA permitting process is unique and complex on recreation.gov. You must choose from more than 30 entry points. Enter the size of your party, whether you want to use a motorboat or a paddle only, etc. This is a difficult and complex system. Outdoor enthusiasts rely on their cooperators to navigate this system for them. The cooperator enters all information prior to January 30th. When 10 a.m. on January 30th hits, the lottery system on recreation.gov would allocate permits in a random and fair manner. It was an imperfect system, but it allowed everyone a fair playing field to receive permits for their customers. This year, the Forest Service arbitrarily altered the system from a lottery system to a first-come, first-served system. Instead of allowing folks to sign up for their desired permits ahead of time, cooperators and individuals now had to all simultaneously log on to recreation.gov at 10 a.m. on January 30th. This year, my office was inundated with calls from outdoor enthusiasts and Forest Service cooperators upset about recreation.gov crashing within minutes into its, quote, go live time, end quote. Only about 1,400 of the tens of thousands of available permits were allocated. To compound the issue, rural broadband access is difficult in my district. With temperatures reaching near 71 below zero in Ely, Minnesota this past year, folks had to invest time and money to drive more than 200 miles south in record cold temperatures to the Twin Cities for reliable internet, only to have this system crash. Within days, I spoke with Associate Chief Lenise Lago and Chief Vicky Christensen of the Forest Service. Both insisted the first-come, first-served system will work when recreation.gov goes live again. About a month later, cooperators and individuals seeking to use the BWC again drove down to the cities in brutally cold temperatures to access reliable broadband so they could attempt to get permits. The system crashed again. At this point, outfitters in my district were hemorrhaging money. One of my constituents, who is a cooperator, estimated that they had already lost about $15,000 in income for their small business for the summer ahead. Therefore, I listened to my constituents and introduced the Lottery Act in late February. As you can see, it simply directs the Secretary of Agriculture to return to the lottery system that worked for the BWCA on recreation.gov. I introduced this bill after holding multiple roundtable and listening sessions in the area, ensuring cooperators and outdoor enthusiasts were able to offer input. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions so we can move this bill forward and provide a meaningful fix to this broken system.
Thank you.
And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stauber. The chair recognizes Ranking Member Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Stauber, just one quick question. Is there a Senate companion bill for this?
My hope is that one of my two state senators, Senators Klobuchar or Smith, will do just that.
Thank you. I yield my time, Madam Chair.
The chair now, thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing today. Earlier this year, I reintroduced the most recent version of the Colorado Wilderness Act, a bill I've introduced each Congress since 1999. It was brought to me by a coalition of Colorado citizens who are committed, as I am, to protecting the few remaining wild areas in our state. The bill before us today, the Colorado Wilderness Act of 2019, protects some of the most cherished and unique areas of our state, Colorado's canyon country. The soaring beauty of these areas is appreciated by everybody who sees them. The legislation also protects many cherished prehistoric sites, which include petroglyphs and ancient Pueblo ruins, particularly in southwest Colorado. Most of the lands in our bill are lower-lying canyon areas, foothills, and lower elevation terrain. This type of landscape is not well represented among Colorado's current wilderness areas because almost all of the existing wilderness in Colorado is above 9,000 feet in elevation. Part of the reason why we don't have lower-lying canyon areas in our wilderness inventory now is because the original Wilderness Act that Congress passed did not include BLM lands. Beginning in 1976, the BLM was directed by the Federal Land Policy Management Act to undertake the process of inventorying lands in Colorado and elsewhere to determine the suitability for wilderness. In 1991, the BLM presented its final list of wilderness study areas, and from then on, those areas have been managed as wilderness to preserve their natural characteristics. About 2/3 of my bill, 21 of 33 areas, are currently listed and managed by the BLM as wilderness study areas. After the WSAs were designated, a group of dedicated citizens took it upon themselves to review and inventory the areas that BLM had recommended, and also to look at additional areas that might have outstanding wilderness characteristics. The first of those reviews was concluded in 1994. These inventories were conducted by volunteers who spent countless hours on the ground mapping and looking at areas that merited wilderness designation, and also conducting stakeholder meetings across the state. Since then, these groups have continued to review and inventory wilderness qualities, with the most recent having been completed in 2017. Over the years, public meetings have been held across western Colorado, seeking input on the proposal. And as a result of those efforts, a revised citizen proposal was published in 2001 and another in 2007. And frankly, my goal is to focus on those areas that are the most deserving of protection. I have to take a little umbrage with what the ranking member said, because these groups have worked tirelessly across the state, and I and my staff have worked tirelessly across the state with local citizens, with other members of the delegation, and with local elected officials. Throughout the lengthy process, we have improved the legislation over and over again. We've removed the Federal Reserve water rights. We've addressed the HATS issue to where now the Colorado National Guard supports the language. We've massaged boundary areas. We've looked at water rights language. We have worked on this bill, and it is ready to be passed into law. The current bill would leave unaffected over 90% of BLM-managed lands in Colorado, and these would remain open to oil and gas drilling, mining, off-road vehicle use, and other development. I just want to point out that in addition to me visiting and the citizens group visiting, over 350 business organizations, as well as 14 counties and municipalities, and many elected officials have endorsed this bill. The increased pressure that we are seeing on public lands makes it even more important to preserve our few remaining wild places. Reasonable people can disagree about whether we should have wilderness altogether, but in Colorado, we have consensus. In the last poll, over 70% of Coloradoans support wilderness designation, and 73% of Coloradoans on the western slope. The public supports this, and it's smart economics too. According to a 2012 Headwaters economics report, protecting public lands is a boon to rural economies. And we have 229,000 additional jobs in Colorado, which is 4 times as much as oil and gas. Madam Chair, I have a lot more to say about the economic benefits, which I will do during the questions. And again, I want to thank you for this important hearing.
Thank you very much, Ms. DeGette. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for including my bill, the Northwest California Wilderness Recreation and Working Forest Act, in today's hearing. My district includes some of the most majestic landscapes and biodiverse ecosystems in California. It's home to the only major undammed river in the state, the Smith. It's home to old-growth forests like our ancient redwoods, unparalleled outdoor recreation opportunities like hiking, fishing, biking, paddling, and climbing. And being active in the outdoors, experiencing these wild places, and connecting to a healthy environment is the way of life for my constituents. It is sought after also by many visitors to the 2nd District. It's critical to take care of these places and to ensure a future for the communities and economies who rely on them. It's exactly what my bill would do. This bill does reflect input from diverse stakeholders over many years of hard work. It would protect important wild places on federal lands, also restore forests and fish habitat, benefit local economies and wildlife, increase recreational opportunities and spur tourism, and protect communities by increasing fire resilience. Here are a few of the priorities in the bill that I'd like to specifically point out. The bill designates a 730,000-acre special restoration area in the South Fork, Trinity River, Mad River, and North Fork, Eel River watersheds. Restoration in these watersheds would include an extensive network of shaded fuel breaks along roads where fire ignitions are most likely to happen, and would improve the ecological health of forests through careful individual tree removal, particularly in plantations that were replanted as homogeneous stands after clear-cut logging. These collaboratively developed restoration activities will help promote fire resilience. They'll also protect communities, restore diverse forest ecosystems that are naturally adapted to fire, and they'll create local jobs. And my bill would also establish a partnership of federal, state, and local entities to restore public lands and waters that are damaged by something that happens a lot in my district, illegal marijuana grow sites, which pose significant threats to public health, public safety, and law enforcement, wildlife, and water quality. This is critical in my district and elsewhere in the western United States, and I hope our work can serve as a model for other places. My bill is ambitious when it comes to recreation and conservation. It calls for an additional 295 miles of trails with opportunities for hiking, biking, horseback riding, and off-highway vehicle use. It proposes new visitor centers and overnight lodging to boost the rapidly growing outdoor recreation economy and its benefits for communities around those valuable public lands. In California, and this is important to understand, the outdoor economy drives $92 billion in consumer spending. Nearly 700,000 jobs. It results in $6.2 billion in state and local tax revenue. And in my district alone, people spend almost $2 billion a year on outdoor recreation. So it's clear that investing in our public lands now means a future where the environment and the economy can both thrive. Now, this bill would also result in 261,000 acres of wilderness, 379 miles of wild and scenic rivers, designated areas that are critical habitat for endangered salmon and steelhead, and also home to a variety of important native ecosystems and rare plants. The proposals would protect some of the largest intact old-growth oaks, conifers, and redwood forests in California. And finally, these areas include some of the best fishing, swimming, and whitewater runs in the state, so protecting them in perpetuity under the Wilderness Act and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act will ensure that future generations can enjoy the same experience in these wild places that we do today. And lastly, I'd like to explain how this bill was developed. It happened over more than 5 years of hard work. I've been asking stakeholders that whole time what policy issues they think should be addressed in public lands legislation, and this led to a draft bill 3 years ago that included the issues that were raised by a variety of my constituents. This draft bill was available on my website for public review and comment for over a year. I held 4 public meetings, countless smaller group and individualized meetings in my district, and at the public meetings, we had over 500 people attend. This level of stakeholder participation means that we have focused on what the people in Northwest California want to see with their public lands, and that is the bill under consideration today. Now, much of the input we received resulted in changes to the draft bill. I don't have time to run through them all, but I particularly want the ranking member to know that I have done the hard work that he referenced in his opening statement, and that's why you see before you a bill that has broad support in all 4 of the counties that I represent. This broad support, I think, will be reflected in some of the testimony you hear today including from Kent Collard, who's a business owner and constituent, who I'll be welcoming in a few minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Huffman. I thank the sponsoring members of Congress for their valuable testimony, and I now invite Panel 2 to take their places at the witness table. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be part of the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left and red when the time has expired. After the witness has testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. For the awareness of our members, the administration will be testifying to all the bills within their jurisdiction at this time. As such, any questions for the administration should be asked during this panel or submitted for the record. Our third and final panel will include only outside witnesses speaking to the California bills. The chair now recognizes Mr. Frank Bim, Acting Associate Deputy Chief of the National Forest System. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Madam Chairwoman Holland, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the views of the U.S. Department of Agriculture regarding the bills before the subcommittee today. My name is Frank Bim, and I am serving as Acting Associate Deputy Chief for the National Forest System within the USDA Forest Service. Most of the bills under consideration today include designation of new wilderness areas and new sections of wild and scenic rivers. Wilderness and wild and scenic rivers are important parts of the fabric of National Forest System lands. Early in my career, I was a wilderness ranger in Wyoming and enjoyed backpacking, as well as packing with horses, mules, llamas, and goats in Forest Service wilderness areas. I understand firsthand how special these lands and rivers are to both current and future generations, providing opportunities to explore special places in a natural state far from the distractions of a modern world. Later in my career, I managed wilderness as a line officer on 2 forests in Virginia and Kentucky. My experience has helped me understand the process and care we take to ensure recommendations we make to Congress have been extensively analyzed and supported by a deliberative and comprehensive process, which includes significant public engagement. Currently, the agency manages almost 37 million acres of wilderness and just over 5,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers, which provide outstanding opportunities for the American public to experience wildlands and free-flowing rivers in a natural condition. Taken collectively, these bills would add more than 800,000 acres to the National Wilderness Preservation System, add about 800 miles to the National Wild and Scenic River System, provide congressional direction to forest restoration activities, provide for new recreation opportunities, alter how we conduct our land management planning process, change our recreation permitting system, and authorize other activities on certain National Forest System lands. As a matter of policy, USDA supports designation of wilderness areas that have been recommended for designation through our land management planning process, which includes local engagement and public input. USDA also supports designation of wild and scenic rivers that were analyzed and found suitable for designation through our planning process. Our land and resource management plans are developed through a process that is inclusive, collaborative, deliberative, and thoroughly engages the public, tribes, and other interested parties. This allows for wilderness and wild and scenic river recommendations to be weighed against and balanced with other multiple uses in a transparent and public process, and allows for disclosure of the effects of those considerations. To identify potential additions to the National Wilderness Preservation System during Forest Plan revision, we begin with an inventory of all lands that satisfy the criteria of the 1964 Wilderness Act. We then conduct an evaluation of wilderness characteristics and complete an analysis informed by public engagement. And finally, the responsible official decides which areas to recommend to Congress for wilderness designation. To identify and evaluate potential additions to the National Wild and Scenic River System, we use a 3-step process to determine eligibility, preliminary classifications, and suitability of river segments. First, river segments must be free-flowing and possess one or more outstandingly remarkable value to be eligible for consideration. A suitability study then includes an analysis of criteria to satisfy the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. The suitability study may occur during the Forest Plan revision or amendment process. I have detailed in my written testimony our concerns regarding the remaining provisions in these bills, as well as H.R. 1475, which would require the Forest Service to return to using a lottery system to issue permits for the use of motorized and non-motorized boats in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. We look forward to working with the sponsors of these bills and the subcommittee to refine maps, resolve boundary issues, and address other technical concerns described in my written testimony. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on these bills, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bim. The chair now recognizes Ms. Leah Baker, Acting Assistant Director of Resources and Planning at the Bureau of Land Management. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Holland, Ranking Member Curtis, and members of the subcommittee. And thanks for the opportunity to present testimony today. As you said, I am Leah Baker, the Acting Assistant Director for Resources and Planning at the Bureau of Land Management. I'll briefly summarize the written statements concerning the 4 bills that affect the BLM's lands in today's agenda. H.R. 252, the Pershing County Economic Development and Conservation Act, authorizes public land sales, exchanges, and conveyances, and designates 7 new wilderness areas on BLM-managed public lands in Pershing County, Nevada. Secretary Bernhardt is committed to ensuring that public access for outdoor recreation is adequately weighed when determining the appropriateness of the disposal or exchange of public lands. The department supports the goals of H.R. 252 that align with this important priority, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with the sponsor, Mr. Amadei, to address some of the concerns with the bill. The department appreciates the work of Congressman Amadei on H.R. 252 and his efforts to promote the multiple uses while fostering economic development on BLM lands in Nevada. H.R. 2199, the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act, would designate 3 new wilderness areas within the BLM-managed Carrizo Plain National Monument. The bill would also establish the Black Mountain Scenic Area on lands primarily managed by the Forest Service and also the BLM, and designate or expand 9 wilderness areas within the Los Padres National Forest, 2 of which would include some BLM-managed lands. Finally, the bill designates the Condor National Recreation Trail across the Los Padres National Forest and small portions of BLM-managed public lands. The department would like the opportunity to work with the sponsors in the subcommittee to address some technical issues and concerns with the bill. H.R. 2550, the Northwest California Wilderness, Recreation, and Working Forest Act, establishes the South Fork Trinity Mad River Restoration Area, creates or expands 17 wilderness areas, designates 7 new potential wilderness areas, designates new wild, scenic, and recreational rivers, establishes 2 special management areas, and includes a number of additional provisions regarding the future management of lands in this area. The vast majority of these designations are on lands administered by the Forest Service, although some include small portions of BLM and National Park Service managed lands. The department would like the opportunity to work with the sponsors in the subcommittee to address a number of issues and technical concerns with the bill as currently drafted. H.R. 2546, the Colorado Wilderness Act, proposes wide-ranging wilderness designations on over 700,000 acres of lands primarily managed by the BLM and the Forest Service. These designations are largely focused in western Colorado. And while wilderness designations may be appropriate for some of the areas included in the legislation, the department is concerned that certain designations in the bill may present serious conflicts with multiple uses that are of importance to the public, including long-term oil and gas development, high-altitude military training activities, and motorized and mechanized vehicle recreation. In addition, we note that the conservation proposals that have reached fruition over the last decade have been more limited in geographic scope, spanning a county or a specific region. So as a result, the department can't support H.R. 2546 as currently written. We would, however, welcome the opportunity to work cooperatively with the sponsors of the legislation, the subcommittee, and all members of the Colorado delegation on wilderness issues in Colorado. Finally, the department has submitted statements for the record regarding H.R. 2215, the San Gabriel Mountain Foothills and Rivers Protection Act, and H.R. 2642, the Wild Olympics Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. The National Park Service would be happy to respond for the record to any questions you may have on HRs 2215 or 2642. Thank you again for the opportunity to present testimony today on behalf of the Department of the Interior, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about those four initial bills.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. The chair now recognizes Ms. DeGette for 30 seconds to introduce Mr. Steve Banowski.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I'm very delighted to introduce Steve Banowski today to testify on my bill. Steve's been working on the Colorado Wilderness Act for over 10 years, and he's one of our great stakeholders who can attest to the natural beauty of these lands. He's been a leader in the Colorado conservation community for even longer than that and has been working to protect these public lands. I also just want to say hello to Commissioner Erdahl. Thank you so much for traveling also so far to talk about the Colorado Wilderness Act. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll be happy to yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Curtis, Representative DeGette, and members of the committee. My name is Steve Banowski. As she just said, I'm from Lakewood, Colorado. I'm speaking actually for three organizations today: Conservatives for Responsible Stewardship, the Colorado Mountain Club, and the CMC Foundation. The CRS is a national grassroots organization focusing primarily on issues of protection of public lands, renewable energy, and climate change. We are an educational offshoot of the former Republicans for Environmental Protection that was founded in 1995. Our focus is providing educational information to congressional staffs, primarily Republican, and citizens groups in the states where we work. I'm a board member. Colorado Mountain Club was founded in 1912 and is the oldest and largest outdoor education, recreation, conservation group in Colorado. We provide training and skills ranging from easy day hikes in the foothills near Denver to learning to climb big peaks around the world. I'm a past member of the club's board of directors and a current board member of the CMC Foundation. On behalf of the organizations, we have discussed a number of bullet points within our written testimony that's been submitted. I would like to hit upon a couple of those points to help explain why political conservatives, the CRS, are supporting H.R. 2546. The country has seen momentous economic upheavals in the 20 years since Representative DeGette first introduced this bill. Do we all remember Y2K, the dot-com bust? Of course, we remember 9/11. The Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, and the big energy bust of 2014. In those 2 decades, Colorado has come under major assault, and it's not necessarily bad. Unprecedented population growth, with more coming. We have seen the onset of major pressures on the state's open space, its public lands, its water, its transportation infrastructure, among other impacts. Thanks in part to the ski areas, our White River National Forest is the most heavily visited national forest in the country. The Pike San Isabel ranks consistently in the top 5, Rocky Mountain National Park in the top 3 or 4 in terms of visits to national parks. What does this increased population mean for our backcountry? An upside can be growth in visits and outdoor recreation for rural economies that take the right approach to this growth and its management. A major downside is more sprawl that eats into the large areas of wildlife habitat that are needed for traditional uses of the land, such as hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing, and photography. An old quote from many years ago referred to the notion that land is valuable because, quote, no one is making any more of it, unquote. Colorado needs to take action now in order to preserve the wide open spaces that are such a draw to people coming to Colorado, establishing businesses there, and recreating. H.R. 2546 is designed to take advantage of this need by protecting over 740,000 acres of lands with wilderness characteristics. Much of this land is lower or middle in elevation, composed of areas that continue to see recreational activities and visits when the high peaks are closed to many recreationists who either don't ski or, like myself, have retired from hardcore winter mountaineering. Traditional industries such as mining, oil and gas, logging, even livestock grazing can be subject to market fluctuations on a global scale. What are rural counties then to do? Representative DeGette mentioned Headwaters Economics from Bozeman, Montana, that has done studies showing that rural counties in the West that have protected lands such as wilderness have healthier and more vibrant economies with more jobs than do counties without those amenities. It's interesting to note that during the Great Recession, outdoor recreation was the only industry nationally that continued to experience growth, albeit modest in nature. And if I can add one thing, my suitcase for the plane that I head for after this testimony is made by Osprey Packs, an outdoor gear manufacturer that's headquartered in Cortez, Colorado. Years ago, Republicans for Environmental Protection trademarked the slogan, "Conservation is conservative," and we still own a share of that. We believe that the time is now to take action and pass this bill. We believe that it's the common sense conservative thing to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Banowski. The chair now recognizes Commissioner Keenan Ertel, Chairman of the Montezuma County Commission.
Thank you, Chair Holland and Mr. Curtis and the rest of the committee. I'm not sure how to address you all here today, but I'm here in opposition, stating in opposition to the H.R. Bill 2546. I'm testifying as Montezuma County Commissioner, and in that capacity, I can attest to the impacts this sweeping legislation would have on our county and its citizens. This legislation will negatively impact the local economy, culture, and traditions. The impacts will affect individual landowners, agricultural entities, water providers, first responders, and especially the recreation tourism industry. In addition, my fellow commissioners, many colleagues, friends, and fellow citizens have also encouraged me to pass along their opposition to this legislation as it stands. We have 7 major areas of concern with regard to the proposed wilderness designations in southwest Colorado that we feel have not been addressed with us and that the subcommittee needs to be aware of. Number 1, compatibility. The potential wilderness area designation has some real compatibility issues being surrounded by productive private lands. Montezuma County has 3 WSA's wilderness study areas that have been on the books for 30-some years, have also been recommended by the Bureau of Land Management to be not considered wilderness areas. I appreciate your statement here this morning, ma'am. These wilderness areas have been recommended by the BLM to not be wilderness areas. Wildfire in these landscapes is not an if, but a when. Given the steep, rugged terrain, fire starts aggressively move upslope. Wilderness designation offers little hope of successfully suppressing fire starts, and more importantly, impedes mitigating conditions to reduce fire intensity beforehand. Lives and property are at risk here, and wilderness designation will make it harder to protect both. Most wildernesses areas have a let-it-burn policy, whereby naturally occurring wildfires can be left to burn for ecological purposes. If let-it-burn policy is not acceptable for any of the WSAs proposed in Montezuma or Dolores counties, residential homes are too close. As we experienced several years ago in the Menifee burn, we burned 10,000 acres, almost went into an Elk Spring residential property on the east side of that WSA, the Elk Springs, surrounded by privately owned property. Item number 2, best protection of resources. The proposed wilderness designations present a threat to landscapes that have already been well protected under the current management practices, which do not need to be significantly changed. These WSAs are currently very well protected by their obscurity. The fastest way to undermine this de facto protection is to designate these areas as wilderness and flag them on area maps and social media. We cannot speak for other counties here, but here in Montezuma County, we feel other protective designations may be more appropriate for the landscape and for the public. The BLM, who by all measures are the leading authority on the management needs of these landscapes, do not recommend designation for wilderness on any of the 3 WSAs within or partly in with Montezuma County. Menifee Mountain has been almost entirely consumed by fire. I've already mentioned that, sorry. Item number 3, management constraints. The proposed legislation will create management difficulties for both federal and land managers and for surrounding private landowners. Also threatens public health and safety, well-being of citizens of our county and our neighboring counties. Best use of the resources. The proposed legislation undermines the integrity of the BLM land and resource management planning process. Further, it is in conflict with the Montezuma County Comprehensive Land Use Plan. Item 5, harm to water rights. The proposed wilderness designations in Montezuma County are very nearly right at the state line of 2 different states. These wilderness designations may carry for them Federal Reserve water rights. 6, negative impacts to the local economy. Wilderness areas are not always good for a local economy. Wilderness designation is often correlated with rising property values on adjacent lands. While this may initially seem desirable, the end result is often rural gentrification and disruption of the local cultures and traditions, especially within impoverished and minority communities like ours. Wilderness designations do not allow mechanized use. This is a concern when mountain biking is one of our main recreational tourism generators, and at a time when our county is transitioning from oil and gas dependent county to a more sustainable recreation economic base. Anything that adds difficulty to our economy is a problem. Our county has a small population, a huge service area, and has already 73% protected public lands. Every little contribution is important to a rural economy. This is not something that someone from Metro Denver with unlimited tax resources and Starbucks on every corner can relate to. 7, the lack of meaningful support. Next to the very real risk of wildfire, our community input is a great concern. Congressman DeGette has never once made an effort to work with Montezuma County or even acknowledge any of our concerns or coordinate any of her bill writing process. Montezuma County.
Your time has expired, sir.
I'm sorry?
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. The chair now recognizes Mr. Roy Knott, president of the LD Knott Company.
Let me add my thanks to the other panel members for being here today. My story is pretty much a personal one. Growing up in Pacific County on the Washington coast in the early 1950s and 60s, my future career path was pretty clear. I knew I was going to work in the timber industry. The son and grandson of Pacific County loggers, I was proud to take one of the abundant and comparatively well-paid jobs in the timber industry after I finished studying forest engineering at Oregon State University and then eventually went on to Yale University, where I got a master's of forestry degree. I wanted to stay close to home, and like my friends and family, I couldn't imagine working indoors. The work let me continue to enjoy the forests and streams where I had hiked, camped, hunted, and fished when I was a youngster. During a long stint with ITT Rainier in the corporate world, I developed the company's Northwest Forest business plan. Incidentally, I think ITT Rainier at the time was the largest private landowner on the Olympic Peninsula. And I managed its timberlands out of Forks, Washington, right in the middle of the Olympic Peninsula. Corporate career advancement often requires moves, so eventually my family and I were asked to move to the south and then to the northeast to a corporate office. It was all very interesting, but we missed our friends and family and the forest back home. So in 1993, I returned to the Pacific Northwest with a much greater appreciation for the Olympic Peninsula's remaining virgin forests and salmon streams, not just as a draw for tourists, but also as a residential draw for entrepreneurs and forest lovers like myself and my family. That renewed appreciation is also what prompted me to be an early advocate for new Wild Olympics legislation. My own experience as a CEO and entrepreneur is that our area's natural treasures, which provide world-class outdoor recreation, clean water, and our area's high quality of living, are what give us a competitive edge over other regions in attracting and retaining the talented people new companies require. Wilderness and wild and scenic river protections would help protect and grow the local jobs that depend upon our ability to compete for talent against other regions, and they would enhance our recruitment efforts as we work to grow new businesses in the future. As a former timber industry executive, I appreciate that Senator Murray and Representative Kilmer's final compromise proposal was scaled back over time and over many, many meetings, some of which I attended, to ensure that it would not impact current timber jobs. Wild Olympics would protect and promote the same spectacular public lands and high quality of life that are helping to drive growth and create jobs in real estate, tech, healthcare, construction, and many other sectors of our economy today. Our ancient forests, salmon, rivers, and stunning scenery are the North Olympic Peninsula's new comparative economic advantage over other regions. In fact, every few years, the nonpartisan Headwaters Economics Group, mentioned earlier, releases their West is Best studies. It consistently shows that protected public lands in the West can create a comparative economic advantage for rural communities. Headwaters studies show that protected public lands attract companies, entrepreneurs, and workers, certainly consistent with my experience. Rural counties with protected public lands experience stronger economic growth, and protected public lands assist in new employee recruiting efforts, also my personal experience. Incomes are higher near protected public lands, Headwaters Economics also concluded. This is why the Wild Olympic legislation has now been endorsed by nearly 550 local Olympic Peninsula and Hood Canal regional businesses. And that is why I have been a stalwart supporter of Wild Olympics for many, many years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that valuable testimony. Thank you to all of you. The chair will now recognize members for questions, and under Committee Rule 3D, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. And I would first like to recognize Ms. DeGette for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Mr. Banowski, you've been part of the extensive stakeholder planning process around the Colorado Wilderness Act for many years. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Would you agree that the bill has been refined to incorporate the highest quality areas for potential wilderness and deserving areas by conservation groups across the state?
Yes, ma'am.
And why do you think it's important to solicit feedback from local stakeholder groups across the spectrum when discussing which lands are most suitable for wilderness protections?
What I've learned in my studies is that there are two communities at work here. One is the community of place, people who live in a given location. The other is the community of interest, people who don't live there but have an interest in going there. Last year I went to Handy's Peak Wilderness Study Area that's in your bill. That's a very, very thinly populated county. Our Colorado Mountain Club group bought extra groceries there before we went out to the trailhead. When we came back, several of us stopped at the San Juan Soda Shop for ice cream. So we're actually putting money into that local economy as the community of interest.
I've been to Handy's Peak, too. It's quite a spectacular area. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife Agency estimates that the total economic contribution of outdoor recreation has grown to about $62 billion statewide. And in southwest Colorado, the recreation economy brings in over $5 billion and provides more than 50,000 jobs in the region. Are you aware of those kinds of statistics?
I have seen those since I do a fair amount of volunteer work reviewing trail grant applications with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I have not seen the exact specific study, but it does rhyme very closely with what the Outdoor Industry Association has said, and I have seen their studies.
And you mentioned in your testimony and in my testimony, I mentioned this Headwaters Economics Report from 2012, which said that job growth from 1970 to 2010, non-metro western counties with more than 30% of the county in federal land protected status, job growth actually increased by 345%. Is that correct?
I would say yes, because I am somewhat familiar with that study. And I might add that Professor Ray Rasker, who is one of the principals of Headwaters Economics, has a lot of history in Colorado, and I believe he also used to work for the Sonoran Institute in Arizona. So his knowledge of the West is exemplary, I would say.
And the Outdoor Industry Association said that the outdoor recreation economy generated 229,000 direct jobs in Colorado, which is 4 times as many jobs as the oil and gas industry and mining industries combined. Are you aware of that statistic?
Yes, I am, and I would say I really do love multiplier effects.
Right. You know, another thing you mentioned in your testimony, Osprey, the outdoor equipment manufacturer that's actually located in Montezuma County. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Were you aware that Osprey has endorsed the Colorado Wilderness Act because of the economic impact?
I just heard that before the hearing started.
Madam Chair, I'd like to introduce into the record a letter from Osprey supporting the legislation.
Without objection.
I just have a couple more questions for you, Mr. Banowski. Some people say that wilderness designation will make it more difficult for people to enjoy public lands. We heard that from Commissioner Ertl. So I wanted to ask you, is hiking allowed in the wilderness?
Yes.
And how about camping?
Yes.
How about horseback riding?
Yes.
How about canoeing?
Yes.
Hunting?
Yes.
Fishing?
Yes.
And do you know, in this bill that you've worked on, do you know, are existing oil and gas leases grandfathered into this bill?
I'm not all that familiar with the O&G industry, so I can't comment on that.
Okay. And do you know, is the BLM or other federal agency, are they allowed to go in to wilderness areas if there's some kind of an emergency situation with mechanized vehicles?
Yes, that's an administrative exception.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. DeGette. The chair recognizes Ranking Member Curtis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to start with Ms. Baker. And first of all, welcome home. I speak hopefully for all of us in saying that we miss your professionalism and expertise here on the committee and hope you're enjoying your new assignment.
Thank you.
In Utah, as you probably know, my district represents about 65% of it is public lands. I have some counties with over 90% public lands. So we care deeply about responsible management and protecting our lands and appropriate uses on these lands. In your testimony, you stressed the importance of utilizing the best mechanism for protecting resources while respecting the need to balance other important uses. There's a clear theme with many of the bills before us favoring wilderness designation over other designations with little regard as to whether the lands in question possess adequate wilderness characteristics. Why is it important to match land designation with the appropriate characteristics of the land?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Curtis. Under the Bureau of Land Management's Federal Land Policy Management Act and Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Mission, we're constantly trying to balance the conservation requirements of that statute and of our mission with the responsible development requirements. So for some of the wilderness designations in several of these bills that are proposed, the Bureau of Land Management, through our wilderness suitability process that is outlined and supported through the Wilderness Act, have determined that that wilderness designation would preclude some of those other multiple use requirements under the law. So as Ms. DeGette just mentioned, several of the proposals within the Colorado Wilderness Act would have wilderness designations outlaid over valid existing rights with oil and gas uses, and we would hope that to be able to work with her to modify those boundaries in order to ensure that those existing rights and existing uses can continue forward and avoid confusion.
Thank you. Can you talk just a little about multiple use policy and what the process is for decision-making about land characteristics?
Can you repeat the question, sir?
Can you talk about what multiple use policy, about the multiple use policy and what process for decision-making about land characteristics?
Sure. So similar to our colleagues in the Forest Service, we have an extensive land use planning process that's required also by our Organic Act, and that process has multiple steps along the way and also in compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act to engage interested stakeholders, elected officials, other federal agencies that may be neighbors, and John Q. Public, the interested members of the public. And in that process, we look at all of the potential uses of the land and how we look at alternatives for managing those potential uses or potential conflicts of use, and articulate what those options are to the public and ultimately make a decision.
Generally, what makes land compatible for wilderness designation?
Opportunities for solitude, and the untrammeled characteristics of that area.
Thank you. Mr. Bem, in 2011, the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Region and Rocky Mountain Research Station wrote a report responding to a request for information about the Forest Service's response to the bark beetle outbreak in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming at the request of former Senator Udall of Colorado. And Madam Chair, I'd like to submit that entire report for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. The report noted a number of things. There were 4 points that it pointed out that added to the bark beetle infestation. Consecutive years of severe drought, that shouldn't surprise anybody. Funding for pre-commercial and commercial thinning to reduce stand density did not keep pace with the rate of bark beetle outbreak. There was a decline in public acceptance of large-scale timber management practices. Limited accessibility, about 25% of the land just simply wasn't accessible. And land use designations such as wilderness that precluded treatments to reduce susceptibility to insects and diseases. Bark beetles are continuing to cause widespread damage to Colorado's forest, yet our committee majority is doing everything in their power to prevent active management, including thinning and ensuring that the Forest Service has less and less access to areas where treatment is needed. Do you believe, as the report states, that wilderness areas often preclude needed treatments to reduce susceptibility to insects and disease?
What I would say, Congressman, is that wilderness designation would limit our ability to do those treatments and make it, we'd have more steps to go through in order to approve treatments, particularly mechanical treatments of that nature in wilderness.
Would it be fair to say that Congress needs to be careful in making wilderness designations in regards to this issue?
I would not offer advice to Congress, but I would say that we do need to be able to access those areas to treat them for bark beetle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm out of time. And
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. The chair recognizes Mr. Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I do have a couple of questions for the administration witnesses. First, I want to thank both witnesses for the fact that your letters, as they pertain to my bill, expressed an interest and a willingness to work with us on technical concerns and details. I'll take you up on that, and I look forward to a good, productive conversation about those things. There was also a bit of a theme in both letters that I saw that's rather unsurprising. Whenever Congress tells an agency things to do that are new and different, there's a bit of tension. And so I think if I were working for one of your agencies, I would have some of that standard boilerplate about we have existing authorities, we're already doing things. I'd have that at the ready for lots and lots of bills that pass through the Congress. But sometimes things do need to change, and they do need to be done differently. And Mr. Bim, I think that is the case when it comes to fire planning. And so I read your concerns in your letter, where you point out that in my bill, where we direct an integration of fire planning into the management plans for wilderness areas, that you say the Forest Service doesn't do it that way. I want you to know that that provision is in my bill precisely because we have heard from many of the stakeholders in my district that work closely with the Forest Service that things need to be done better. And especially with climate change, with droughts, with so much of the Forest Service's mission now being oriented around fire. Don't you think there's some value in getting out of that silo and beginning to integrate fire planning into the management plans that are done in the other silo?
So I would say a couple things. One, integration is something we're very much focused on, integration across our fuels management treatment and vegetation management treatment. So integration as a concept is absolutely something we believe in and strive to work towards. The concern as it relates to our forest planning process is that it's, there's a number of steps there that if we could particularly incorporate some fire aspects into our plan revision process, but those processes are between 10 and 15 years apart, sometimes longer. We're actually fairly, we have some of our plans that are pretty out of date, and so we need to be more current with our fire planning, and that's why we keep fire planning out of the forest plan revision process.
But as you update those stale plans that probably need to be updated in many cases anyway, do you have any principled opposition to integrating fire planning in that process?
No principled opposition to bringing the concepts of fire planning into that process. In terms of how we do it, we'd have to.
I do hope we can keep working together on that, because I think it's basically just a good idea, and I think would result in better work in the forest. Ms. Baker, in your testimony, you note that while the department recognizes the value of establishing new recreation opportunities like a visitor center that is proposed in my bill, the department and the Park Service have to focus resources on reducing the $11.9 billion deferred maintenance backlog. And I don't mean to be too provocative with this question, but I have to say, did you express the same concerns a week ago when The media reports that $2.5 million of Park Service budget was redirected for a parade and a military spectacle on the National Mall. Do you think that parking tanks on the mall for what essentially was a political event is the highest and best use of these resources rather than the types of things we're calling for in this bill? And did you express these same concerns about limited resources when President Trump asked the Park Service to redirect these funds?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Huffman. I appreciate it. I am not prepared to speak to the Park Service specific funding decisions that were made recently. I'm here to be able to comment on the Bureau of Land Management specific proposals.
Are you aware of concerns that were raised by Park Service personnel or others of the Department of Interior about the redirection of these funds for the military spectacle?
No, sir, I'm actually not.
All right. Madam Chair, I'll yield the balance of my time to Ms. DeGette.
Thank you. Ms. Baker, I just wanted to ask you, many of the areas in my legislation were identified by the BLM in the original wilderness inventory back in the early 1990s. Is that correct?
Correct.
And of those wilderness study areas, all of them have been managed as if they were wilderness areas since that date. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that would mean for those areas, there would be no motorized use, ATVs or mountain bikes or anything like that since the 1990s. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct with perhaps some
And I just want to say, Madam Chair, I appreciate her coming, and I appreciate BLM working with me, and I will look forward to continue to work with you on all of these areas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. DeGette. The chair recognizes Mr. Lambourne for.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. This is an important hearing. These are important bills. And I'm just here today as a member of the full committee, though not a member of the subcommittee. I appreciate that. I just wanted to introduce into the record and read into the record a letter dated July 9th to the Honorable Don Young, who's a member of this committee and subcommittee, from Daniel Hokanson, Lieutenant General, U.S. Army, Director, Army National Guard. So I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce this into the record. And it's a short.
Without objection.
Thank you. And it's just a short letter. I'll just read it. I think it speaks for itself. And I'm not here to ask any other questions, but I just want to make sure all the facts are out on the table. Dear Ranking Member Young, I am responding to your inquiry regarding the Impacts House resolution. I think that should be House of Representatives 2546 will have on the U.S. Army National Guard High Altitude Aviation Training Site, or HATS, in Gypsum, Colorado. HATS is an Army aviation school that provides graduate-level flight training for mountain techniques and power management at high altitudes. The facility serves the entire Department of Defense and our international partners. Aviators at HATS learn skills that translate to both domestic and overseas operations, which have resulted in safe operations of military aircraft in high-altitude environments and countless lives saved. H.R. 2546 would substantially affect HATS by designating 40% of the current training area as a wilderness area, thus limiting the ability for aviators to utilize current landing zones. Wilderness areas are categorized as noise-sensitive areas and require aircraft to operate at a minimum of 2,000 feet above ground level. The proposed legislation would cause aviators to travel greater distances to access landing zones for training, therefore reducing the overall efficiency of each flight and reducing the total throughput of aviators trained in a given year. The training conducted at HATS is critical to mitigate risk for service members conducting missions in high-altitude, rough terrain. HATS graduates are the only individuals that obtain the skill sets necessary for high-altitude operations and rescue missions. Two examples illustrate the benefits of this specialized training. On 24 June 2019, Vail Mountain Rescue Group requested assistance from the Colorado Army National Guard to provide search and rescue operations for two skiers trapped in an avalanche in the vicinity of Holy Cross. The HATS trained Colorado Army Reserve National Guard, in coordination with the Vail Mountain Rescue Group, safely located, rescued, and evacuated the injured personnel to a medical treatment facility. Further, a HATS graduate aviator conducted a medical evacuation mission in the Helmand province of Afghanistan, where the talcum fine brown dust damaged the aircraft engines. The pilot was able to use the power management techniques he acquired at HATS to safely land and move the medics and wounded soldiers up and out of the extremely hazardous area. Those are just two of many examples that illustrate the importance of HATS training for our military aviators. The ARNG estimates HR 2546 will reduce the number of aviators we are able to train annually between 47% and 67%. And then the letter concludes with, if you have any additional questions or concerns, there's contact information.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
So as the gentleman knows, both Mr. Neguse and I have been working both with your office, Mr. Lamborn, and also the Colorado National Guard, and also with the National Guard about this HATS issue for quite some number of years. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
And so I'm a little dismayed to receive this letter right here at the hearing. It's dated July 9, 2019, just 2 days ago. This is the first time I've seen this letter. And I guess what I would say, Mr. Lamborn, is that we will continue to work with you and with the National Guard, because we all believe, Mr. Neguse believes, I believe, you believe, we all believe that the HATS process is a really important process, and that nothing we do in this bill should interfere with it. And we have been, like I say, we've been working on this for a long time, so we will continue to work with you to get acceptable language to everyone.
Okay, excellent.
And I'll yield back. Thank you for yielding.
Excellent. I'm reclaiming my time. I just saw this morning myself. And this is a critical issue. I don't think we're quite there yet. And if there's any conflict or not disagreement, but difference of perspective between the State National Guard and the National Guard, we need to take both into account.
And we need to get them talking to each other.
Yeah. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. The chair recognizes Mr. Neguse for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing. Thank you to Representative Huffman for bringing his important bill, and of course to my colleague in Colorado, Representative DeGette, for her leadership and her work on these issues for many, many years, and her tireless efforts to protect public lands in the incredible state that we are both so lucky to call home. I'm privileged and honored to be able to support her bill and to be able to talk to the witnesses today who have appeared about the bill in particular. I wanted to, just a quick question first for Mr. Bume, did I pronounce it right?
Bim, like Tim with a B.
Bim, sorry,
Yeah,
my apologies.
no worries.
Mine's a tough one as well. So,
Yep.
I appreciate you being here, and of course appreciate the hard work of the folks at the Forest Service. With respect to your written testimony regarding Representative DeGette's bill, there's a portion, I believe it's in paragraph 3 of your testimony, in which you state that there are some areas that, in your view, don't comport, I believe it's a limited number of areas, with the forest management plans that have been developed by the Forest Service. Can you confirm whether or not those forest management plans are, in fact, not out of date?
Yes, sir. That is, yes, I can. And what I would tell you is that the forest plans are in various stages of revision, what I would say. White River was revised in 2002, so that's a fairly current plan, although 17...
Well, but it's not, I mean, so I'll just stop you there. The reason why I asked this question is we've had similar testimony from some of your colleagues,
Yes.
the Forest Service, who have, been eager to, I think, testify on a variety of different wilderness bills that are coming before this committee, using the forest plans as the justification or rationale for the Forest Service opposition, when in fact those forest management plans are out of date. They're under your Organic Act and a variety of other statutes. The Forest Service is required to update those plans. In the case of White River, as you just mentioned, which happens to be in my congressional district, was last updated in 2002, and it's required to be updated every 15 years. And so that plan is now out of date, which certainly local communities could attest to. So I guess that's why I was asking for confirmation with respect to this particular piece, and I don't know if you can...
The only thing I would add, I guess, is that Grand Mesa, Uncompahgre, Gunnison is undergoing a revision right now, and they've started their wilderness review process, I believe, a year ago. But you're right, some of these plans are pretty far out of date. We acknowledge that. So what I would say is we've been able to do an initial analysis of the areas within the bill, and we'd be happy to work with the sponsor and you as a co-sponsor in the committee to provide more information on our views on the proposed wilderness additions.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate your candor, sir, and certainly look forward to continuing to work with you all in good faith. And I think that context is important for the committee as we do our work, because it's important as we make the decisions we're making that we have timely plans that are up to date, right, from the Forest Service. And at least in some of these cases, it doesn't seem to be the case. Mr. Bowanowski, I just wanted to follow up with some of what you said to Representative DeGette in regards to the many benefits of the bill before the committee. Beyond the economic impacts, what other benefits do you believe public land protections like those in H.R. 2546 bring to the general public in the state of Colorado?
Thank you for the question, Representative Neguse. Our philosophy is rather broad-based. We consider wilderness designation as true multiple use because of all the activities that can occur in that. Representative DeGette asked me a series of questions of what's allowed in designated wilderness. To that, I would include wheelchairs because there is no conflict between the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Wilderness Act. From a conservation environmental viewpoint, wilderness areas are highly protected areas, the highest possible protection, which means they preserve clean water. And in Colorado, several of the local jurisdictions depend on wilderness study areas or designated wilderness as sources of their clean drinking water. It's also an area for clean air. And although we can't help what comes in from other states to the west because of the winds, and it's simply put, it's prime wildlife habitat. And hunting and fishing are big economic drivers as part of outdoor recreation in our state. And if we don't have wildlife habitat, we don't have high-quality wildlife and experiences.
Thank you, sir. With that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. The chair recognizes Mr. Folker for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, I have a letter in front of me from the American Forest Resource Council, and I'd ask unanimous consent that letter be entered into the record regarding H.R. 2642, if I may, please.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A question, though, for me centers on H.R. 2546, and I'd like to ask Mr. Ertel, if I may. Mr. Ertel, as County Commissioner of Montezuma County, how big of a deal is it to your county with tourism? How much of your economic driver is accounted for by tourism?
A great deal. I can't give you the exact percentages because we do not incur a sales tax. Montezuma County is one of the few counties in the state of Colorado that does not have any association with sales tax. But I do know that a great deal, we have Mesa Verde National Park, we have the Canyon of the Ancients National Monument, we have Tribal Park, Mountain Ute Tribal Park, that are all somewhat of a destination for tourism and travel, as well as our mountain country for hunting and fishing that Mr. Dombrowski talked about, that are all basically public lands, which are absolutely 73% of our county is public lands. And recreation is a large driver, and we want to see that driver continue as an economic driver in our community. And sometimes through restricting the types of access, mountain biking and certain types of other recreation that we see as a booming, being tied to Moab and Telluride and different areas that are really thriving on mountain biking and that type of outdoor experience. That is a large driver in our county.
It's actually a big part of my follow-up is if this bill passes, then what, in your opinion, again, County Commissioner, your local government, you're closer to it than we are. What happens to that revenue stream? What happens to that impact for your county if this bill passes?
I think it will put restrictions on it. Anytime you start putting a property and land in the most stringent classifications of accessibility and usage of that land, you're going to definitely restrict the types and numbers of people that are going to come to visit you and use your use your public lands for recreation.
So you're clearly limited. I was going to ask you how much of a percentage of Montezuma County was federally owned, but you already said 73%. It's a big number.
And I do believe that includes, we have one reservation, the Mountain Ute Indian Reservation, as well as national parks, and our national parks are expanding. We had a private donor contribute 160 acres of private land to the Yucca House National Monument, and so our monument people of the Canyon of the Ancients have spent about $9 million expanding their national monument. So the private land ownership in Montezuma County keeps shrinking.
So with that, another question on a related note. So of that land in Montezuma County, do you have any problems with wildfires? Has that been something that's been prevalent?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking here the Menifee Mountain WSA 4 years ago burned. It's an absolute moonscape. Now it's a weed-infested moonscape that we are very restricted on what we can do. It's a wilderness study area, mechanized treatment, chemical treatments, different things to go in and try and treat the noxious weed problem that's arisen from the fire that happened there, and it absolutely burned itself right down to the dirt.
So if this goes into wilderness area, is that going to make is that going to improve the circumstances which will limit that wildfire danger more, or what's going to happen with that?
No, because it's going to take a long time for it to grow back, but no, it will remain just that, and the potential to do the same thing again in another 20 or 25 years.
So how long have you been a commissioner, Mr. Ertel?
7.5 years.
Okay, so in your experience, when lands get designated as wilderness, does that have a tendency to imply better management over the course of time for a better and result in a better environment, or not necessarily?
Well, this land and these WSAs have been treated as wilderness areas for 30-some years, and I have seen nothing that is proposed or proven to be beneficial to Montezuma County at all. I've seen it proposed as a detriment in the wildland fire that we experienced in the Menifee. I saw it as a detriment.
Thank you, Commissioner. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fulker. The chair recognizes Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to yield my time to the representative from Colorado, Representative Daggett.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Mr. Ertel, Commissioner Ertel, I wanted to just follow up on a couple of the questions that were just asked. Now, in the area in this bill in Montezuma County, there are 2 areas that are currently wilderness, 2 or 3, depending on how you define them,
right,
that are currently wilderness study areas. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you have some other BLM wilderness study areas in Montezuma County that are not in this bill. Is that correct?
I don't believe so. I think
there are a couple of more that aren't in my bill.
okay, that very well could be true.
What I wanted to ask you of these areas have been managed, I think you just said this, they've been managed as wilderness study areas since 1991. Is that right?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you, are there oil and gas leases in these areas that you know about?
No, they're not.
No, they're not, because I thought there were some leases in these areas, and I wanted to let you know if there are, they're grandfathered in.
If there are leases, they are inactive leases.
Right, but they would all be grandfathered in under this bill. I also wanted to ask you, has the economy grown in Montezuma County in the last number of years?
Certainly.
And would you say tourism and outdoor recreation has grown in your county?
Absolutely.
And when did Osprey locate into Cortez, Colorado? Do you know?
Well, Osprey started in Dolores, Colorado
Okay.
as an infant company, moved their headquarters and production in. It's kind of an interesting take. I'm glad you brought that back up. Osprey, as they have grown and expanded and become very successful in the mountain gearing and backpacking
Right.
industry, They got to the place that they could no longer manufacture in Cortez. At one time, they're manufactured, distribution,
So they moved their,
everything.
yeah,
They
they
moved to
them in.
Vietnam, they moved their distribution to Ogden. So what we have remaining in Cortez is their administrative international headquarters,
Super.
which is their IT and so.
Okay,
So
thanks. But you
we've
would-
won and lost at the same time.
You would say, though, that certainly outdoor recreation has increased in these areas.
Absolutely.
And also, in between Weber and Menifee, which kind of go like this,
Yes.
you guys are working with the BLM to build a parking lot there, is that right?
I don't believe that's on the, we're working up on the very north end, up by Summit Reservoir. We're trying to do an
Put a parking lot?
equestrian, but I don't
And
believe
that's so
that.
you can get more recreation in it,
Right, but I don't believe that's in the Menifee or the,
Oh, okay. Okay. So now, we haven't had, so you got a lot of federal land, 73% in Montezuma County, but only a tiny bit of it is these wilderness study areas, right?
yes,
And
very,
people can
well,
ma-
they're
people can-
almost so small they don't qualify for wilderness
Exactly.
areas. They're tiny little
Exactly.
islands in the middle of
So
the,
you can have mountain biking in those other areas.
we've got tremendous mountain biking
Right.
in the other areas, exactly.
Okay, thanks. Now, I do want to say one thing to you. I'm a fourth-generation Coloradoan, and I've lived in Colorado my whole life, and in fact, I've been in your part of the state many, many times because we used to have a whole branch of my family that lived down there in Durango. But you do make a good point, which is I personally have not been to these two areas, 2.5, 3 areas in Montezuma County, even though the citizen groups that Mr. Banowski talked about have exhaustively researched that, and that's on me. And so I will commit to you in the next few months, I hope in the August recess, I'm going to come down there and meet with the county commissioners and have a local town hall meeting and go to these areas, just as I have with dozens of these areas across the state. And I apologize to you that I haven't made it down there. Sadly, I do have this little day job in Washington, so it's not my choice, but it does limit me being able to go. But I'll be down there soon to see these areas. And I really want to thank you, and I really want to thank Mr. Banowski for coming all the way from Colorado. And I want to thank the federal agencies, too, for continuing to work with us on this bill. And Mr. Lowenthal, I will yield back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The chair recognizes Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bem, these are going to be particular questions to you. In the Lottery Act, going from the lottery to the first come, first serve, I just want to ask you a few questions. In your testimony, you stated that your goal, quote, is to distribute the quota of permits to the public in an equitable manner. If you were not aware, my constituents in Ely, Minnesota, and Grand Marais, Minnesota, have little to no access to reliable internet. Do you expect cooperators in the district with unreliable internet service to compete with folks nationwide that have strong internet access?
Sir, I was actually not aware of the limited
Okay,
internet access.
thank you. And I'm glad you said you were not aware of that. Furthermore, your testimony claims the improvements include search and navigation tools that more intuitively provide access to information and the ability to return results based on a map search or areas of interest, and allows the ability to directly communicate with staff and visitors. Now, I would like you to I want to read some complaints to you. This is on March 6th. This is a terrible system. On there and ready before 9 a.m. and did not get a single permit. Not the experience we were hoping for when we booked this trip originally. On March 4th, this was too stressful. Please bring back the old system. One more. Hey, Bob, I just got off the phone with rec.gov for 45 minutes. By the time I got a human, the day use permits for the month of June were gone. That trip is one of our favorite things. It's just too bad. A consistent complaint I hear is that none of my cooperators or local citizens, Mr. Bem, that know the area well were ever allowed input. Was there any local input in the change? Not telling them about the change, but was there local input on the change?
Sir, I'll have to get back with you on that. I'll have to
Okay,
check with
thank
the
you.
region on that. You bet.
My question or my comment is this. Mr. Bem, I held 2 meetings. By the way, I want to say thank you for your service as a representative of the United States Forest Service.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for that. All these years, you have a lot of experience. But I want to tell you about an experience I had in a meeting when a cooperator in Ely, Minnesota has been doing it for 50 years, because I had a hearing over this disaster that the Forest Service pushed on us. He said, Congressman Stauber, it's a waste of time to work with the Forest Service because they haven't listened in 50 years. That was a grave and a great concern to me. Because, Mr. Bem, who is the U.S. Forest Service and who do they work for?
We work for the American public, sir.
Thank you. We the people. And to have the U.S. Forest Service take a system that they felt didn't work and shove it down the throats of the cooperators in Ely, Minnesota and Grand Marais in the most beautiful, pristine wilderness, the BWSA, that this country has to offer, and change it without any input is disgraceful. And when I have a cooperator in Ely, Minnesota, Mr. Bem, the economy is real fragile. These cooperators need the business. And when a cooperator says this change in one group of people cost him $15,000, that's real money, Mr. Bem. I am disappointed in the United States Forest Service, and I would tell you this, not our local foresters, but I'm disappointed that this decision came from Washington, D.C. This is exactly what the concern the public has with bureaucrats making these decisions. The BWCA is a beautiful wilderness for us all to enjoy. And the U.S. Forest Service went and changed the way the system was to work. And when I asked why, well, we had some complaints. That was why. Mr. Bem, in your testimony, you state, reinstating the previous lottery system would cause management challenges. Mr. Bem, I tell you what, management challenges for the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. don't even equate to the problems the cooperators have in Ely, Minnesota and Grand Marais. So your management problems, Mr. Bem, in the U.S. Forest Service are brought to Ely, Minnesota, where we can't even get people to get into the permitting system, and the cooperators are losing money. So my constituents matter more than your management problems. Mr. Bem, I will say this. The U.S. Forest Service must start listening to the people. You said you work for the people. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stauber. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. And so I had one question. Ms. Baker, as I'm sure you know, the Carrizo Plain National Monument is home to the largest concentration of endangered species in California and contains the largest remaining natural alkali wetland in California. Beyond the area's ecological significance, over 100 Native American heritage sites have been identified on the Carrizo Plain. Unfortunately, it is my understanding that your agency has approved a new oil well and pipeline inside the Carrizo Plain National Monument and recently announced its plans to offer new oil and gas leases on 1.6 million acres in the area. What safeguards have been put into place to ensure that these activities do not threaten endangered species and negatively impact sites considered culturally important to Native American tribes who have inhabited the area for over 10,000 years?
Thank you for the question, Chair Holland. So as you're probably aware, the proclamation that created the Carrizo Plain National Monument, which is approximately 20 years old, included in it the requirement to consider valid existing rights. So previous leases, in particular for oil and gas, as the example you bring up, would be able to maintain through the duration of the lease. So as we approve specific permits for pipelines related to those leases or drilling related to that particular lease, we have to take into account as well as our regular day-to-day public domain considerations for protection of the environment, the specific characteristics for which the monument was proclaimed. So all of those special resources, or what we call in our parlance, the objects of the monument, are considered and taken into evaluation as that particular permit to drill or particular pipeline is approved. I can't speak to the specifics of this particular project because I did not work on it, but I'd be happy to get back to you to ensure that we're able to answer how the cultural resources, the sensitive environmental resources, in particular the tribal concerns, were addressed within the monument. The monument, oh, pardon me.
No, I would appreciate that, a follow-up on, specifically on this.
Certainly.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Mr. Gomer. I yield back my time. The chair recognizes Mr. Gomer for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the witnesses being here. I've been watching from television the testimony. I want to follow up on what Mr. Congressman Stauber was talking about, Mr. Bim. You know, my understanding when the national forests were conceived and created, there was an agreement with local government to give up their land that they would no longer be able to tax, and the agreement would result in the federal government managing the forests. Now, in East Texas, where I live, we got a couple of national forests. We don't have any redwoods. We don't have any sequoias. Those are absolute treasures that we need to protect. We got pine trees. They're one of the greatest renewable resources in this country. I'd encourage more people to use pine. It's just a terrific renewable resource. And we get full use out of every part of every pine tree. But I've seen the numbers. Sabine County, for example, a very rural county, San Augustine, they rely heavily on, since so much of their county or national forest, they rely on what is produced by the National Forest Service. I have constant complaints from those counties, Sabine County, San Augustine County, Shelby County, that the Forest Service, they consider the forest to be their personal woods. They don't mind letting culverts fall into disrepair so people can't get into them. They don't mind seeing use diminish by people wanting to have access and use our national forests. And they certainly have dropped production down to a fraction of what it once was. Sabine County, for example, they've shown me the numbers back in the 1980s. They're 25% of the Forest Service production off their county's land was around $1.4 to $1.6 million, which helped them tremendously with their schools and their local government. I see that last year Sabine County had gotten, well, I guess it was 2016, but they'd gotten around $36,000. That doesn't hardly keep a school going. It doesn't hardly keep a local government able to even put asphalt in the potholes. So I made great strides. I'll tell you, I made great strides in pushing the former chairman toward giving back some of those lands so it can be taxed, it can be productive, because the National Forest Service is destroying, is killing schools, it's killing the counties, it's killing the local government, and something has to be done. And I realize it will probably take Republicans getting back in the majority, but something's got to be done, and either we need to produce those renewable resources that are such a wonderful, what some of us consider a gift of God for East Texas, or we got to give the land back, at least a big part of it, some of it, so that the counties, the schools can survive. Who suffers? The kids in the schools do. They should not have to suffer in the schools as a result of the National Forest Service, at least the local folks considering the forest to be their own instead of the gift to the local residents as it should be, and actually to all the country. So I am going to sign on to Stauber's bill. I think it's a great idea. I'm sorry it's an inconvenience to the bureaucrats to go back to a lottery, but we got to get, that's the point of having federal land so people can enjoy it. And if they can't enjoy it, it needs to go to somebody that can. And so we need a lottery there, and we either need the National Forest Service to get back to using the land, or we need to get it in the hands of somebody that can. You have a quick comment?
Yes, sir. So
I'll give the gentleman, since you were pretty directly invoked in those comments, please take 30 seconds to respond, if you would.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member. Yes, sir. So yes, we'd be pleased to work with you and Congressman Stauber certainly on the situation on the Boundary Waters canoe area. We recognize that what happened in January was not acceptable to anyone, and it's not about being an inconvenience to us. We're absolutely want to put a system in place that works for everyone. So we'd be happy to work with you on that. And Mr. Stauber, as regards to National Forest and grasslands in Texas, I'm very familiar with that, sir. My normal job is Deputy Regional Forester in the southern region in Atlanta. And so what's happening in Texas actually is they've been increasing their harvest, but they're using stewardship contracting as opposed to regular sales, and that is impacting 25% payments to county. So I'd be happy to have a broader conversation.
I'd like to see that change too, but thank you for your indulgence.
Indeed. We'll now recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses, not only for being here today, but for the work that you do routinely. It's most appreciated. Mr. Stauber's bill, H.R. 1475, reminds me of an opportunity I had just weeks ago to meet with young student leaders who came to my office to discuss their love of Minnesota's boundary waters and how their relationship and interaction with this wilderness has deeply impacted their lives. They shared stories with me on how the boundary waters taught them to care for and protect our environment in an effort to truly appreciate the beauty of nature while leaving no trace behind. Stories like theirs are a reminder to all of us of our duty to these special places and our job here in Congress to protect them, ensuring their conservation for future generations. The Kids for the Boundary Waters and other groups have expressed their serious concerns to me that the Trump administration has made available a sulfide or copper mining site adjacent to the boundary waters. In 2016, their leases had been denied after the Forest Service found that copper mining in the watershed presented an unacceptable risk to the boundary waters and the Superior Natural Forest. I am indeed troubled that the Trump administration has time and time again ignored good science to prioritize the interest of industry over that of all Americans. These issues also raise questions on the importance of protecting our watersheds. Across the country, over 60 million people are dependent upon watersheds protected by the Forest Service for their water supply. In the face of continued climate change, it is critical that we safeguard these critical areas to protect the resources that communities rely upon. So, Mr. Bim, would the proposals in H.R. 2250 help improve the Forest Service's ability to conduct watershed restoration projects and protect precious clean water resources?
Sir, thank you for the question. So the restoration components within H.R. 2250 are something we would like to work with the sponsor on. It's something that, we do that type of work through our regular course of business, and would be happy to work with the sponsor and the subcommittee on that language and the intent of that section of the bill.
Very good. And Mr. Knott, based on your work in the forest restoration industry, can you speak to how safeguarding clean water, as proposed in the Wild Olympics bill, also supports forest health and timber extraction?
Once again, on the Olympic Peninsula, there is a forest collaborative that Representative Kilmer has helped promote, and it's actually increasing the cut on some of the forest lands within that area. What's unique about the Olympic National Forest and the area that we're talking about is the fact that the rivers are relatively pristine. What we're talking about is permanent protection for some lands that are already protected. And as a result, our salmon streams are reasonably healthy, certainly compared to California or Oregon. They're much healthier. So not just our salmon industry, but the balance of industry within our area is served.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have some 2 minutes remaining. Does anyone want to use my time? Mr. Chair?
Well, I would use it to defend the salmon streams of California, but the gentleman's right. We have made a mess of too many of them, so I appreciate that comment. Are there other members that would like the balance of Mr. Tonko's time?
Chairman?
Would you yield to Ms. Degat?
Yes, I yield
Thank you.
to...
I just have unanimous consent request, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of documents I'd like to place into the record. The first one is a list of dozens of business endorsements for the Colorado Wilderness Act of 2019, a letter from the Wilderness Workshop endorsing the bill, a letter from a coalition of groups, 72 different groups endorsing the bill. I have a copy of the Headwaters Economics analysis that both Mr. Banowski and I referred to, called West is Best, How Public Lands in the West Created Competitive Economic Advantage. And I have a study by the Colorado Parks and Wildlife entitled The Economic Contributions of Outdoor Recreation in Colorado, a Regional and County Level Analysis. I'd ask unanimous consent that all of these documents be placed in the record.
Seeing no objection and no one even here to object, your unanimous consent request is granted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
All right, thank you. I would like to thank the panel, and you are excused. Thank you, all of the witnesses, for your valuable testimony. We'll now invite the third and final panel to come forward and take their places at the witness table. As you do that, I will just remind the third panel that your oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will be entered as part of the hearing record. Just a reminder to our witnesses that when you begin your testimony, there'll be a green light. When that light turns yellow, it's telling you that you've got 1 minute to conclude, and when it turns red, of course, your time has expired. After all the witnesses in the panel have testified, we will bring it back to the members for questions. Not going to make it. So there are no specific introductions to these. Okay. Okay, very good. I'll take that. I will now recognize myself for a brief introduction because I've got a couple of constituents on this panel. And first I want to introduce Mr. Kent Collard, who is from Hayfork in my district, a beautiful part of Trinity County. Mr. Collard has been the director at Bar 717 Ranch Camp in Trinity County since 1998. This is a unique working ranch that also provides a wilderness experience has for generations of young people. It's an amazing place doing great work. And Mr. Collard is also a fourth-generation landowner in Trinity County. So thank you for joining us today. Mr. Collard, look forward to hearing more. And also a hello to Supervisor Keith Groves from beautiful Trinity, another beautiful part of Trinity County. We welcome you to the committee and look forward to your testimony as well. We will begin by hearing from let's see if I got this right. Yeah, from Graciela Cabello, Director of Youth and Community Engagement for Los Padres Forest Watch. Ms. Graciela, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, honorable committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And I'm here to support the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act, HR 2199. My name is Graciela Cabello, and I want to share my knowledge on how public lands affect Latino communities, youth, and why protecting the Central Coast can help remove economic barriers to recreation and improve access to our natural places. I was born and raised on the Central Coast in the beach town of Santa Barbara. It is known to many as an affluent community, but those of us who grew up there know that the town is not an exception to economic disparities. I am the proud daughter of immigrants who made a life there through hard work, servicing the town's middle class and wealthy residents. During my youth, summer days were rarely spent at the beach, and instead we spent time floating down the San Ynez River, seeing wildlife in the area for the first time, and traversing up a mountain to experience the sunset over the San Ynez Valley. You see, my parents grew up in rural Mexico, surrounded by hillsides, rivers, and agricultural landscapes. And it was because of this resemblance to home and nostalgia that we often visited the Los Padres National Forest. It was a place our family and our extended family could gather that felt accessible and provided something for all ages. These early experiences had a significant impact in the career choices I would later make. In 2015, I joined a startup national nonprofit called Latino Outdoors as the founding national director. It was through this work that I began to better understand the relationship that Latinos have with the environment, where cultural heritage, health, recreation, and jobs are concerned. I support the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act because as someone who has been influenced by a long lineage of Latin American and indigenous beliefs, protecting the natural world is a moral obligation, and it is deeply rooted in my culture. We have a history of taking care of the land for generations, and today I am here to honor that history. Research shows that 68% of Latino voters want Congress to place more emphasis on protecting sources of clean water, air quality, and wildlife habitat while providing opportunities to visit and recreate on our national public lands. This bill would designate over 226,000 acres of wilderness and protect nearly 159 miles of streams as wild and scenic rivers. Polls show that 94% of Latinos in Western states see public lands as national parks, forests, monuments, and wildlife areas, and as an essential part of the economy. Many of the communities that surround the forest or the Carrizo Plain National Monument have a significant Latino population that relies on these natural resources to make a living, as well as in the tourism economy. They are restaurant owners, farmers, mechanics, and other business owners, and the farm workers that harvest our food. Permanent protection of our unique wildlands and scenic rivers will ensure our communities have a sustainable source of drinking water as well as for agriculture and for hunting, fishing, and other recreation Latinos value. My exposure to these wild places as a child was largely due to geographical access and low economic barriers. This is the case for many of the communities up and down the Central Coast. Many recreational opportunities exist within an hour's drive of home, for much less than the cost of visiting an amusement park. National parks may provide some of the same benefits, but they are not as accessible to residents as the places in their own backyard. In my current role as the Director of Youth and Community Engagement for Los Padres Forest Watch, I connect some of the area's youth to our most treasured places in the forest. Many of them come from under-resourced families or communities and are struggling with their academic performance, social harmony, and other areas of their well-being. Research consistently shows that nature makes children smarter, happier, and healthier. Psychologists believe that experiencing awe from wild places can play an important role in bolstering happiness, health, and social harmony. I have seen this type of cooperation firsthand with the youth in the forest every time we visit a new area. I experience their behavior go from guarded, indifferent, and uncooperative when they arrive at the trailhead to upbeat, attentive, and sociable as the day goes on. I'm fortunate to be able to witness the transformative power of our local communities and rivers on the effect it has on the youth. The Los Padres is at the center of one of America's only biodiversity hotspots, which is defined as the Earth's biologically richest and most endangered ecoregions. We are all future ancestors, and we have a historic opportunity to protect this special place for all people and leave a legacy for future generations. I strongly encourage the committee to support H.R. 2199. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cabell. We'll now recognize Mr. Diaz for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Huffman and honorable committee members. My name is David Diaz, El Monte resident, El Monte Union High School District Board President, and Executive Director of Active San Gabriel Valley, where our mission is to create a more sustainable, equitable, and livable San Gabriel Valley, We're also a member organization of Nature for All, a coalition of 12 organizations who have worked over 8 years on federal protections for the San Gabriel Mountains and watershed. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today in support of HR 2215, a bill supported by local community members, business, and local electeds that would help ensure recreational access for park-poor and pollution-burdened communities and protect our public lands, waters, and wildlife for today and for future generations. I'm here today to address issues that our families face in regards to accessing one of America's greatest assets, our public lands. Thankfully, HR 2215 seeks to address some of these challenges. I was born in Ensenada, Mexico, but raised in the communities of Almani and South Almani, California, where my parents worked multiple jobs to provide financial security and opportunity for our family. Nearly 1/3 of the children in these communities is considered obese, well above the national average of 18.5%. My childhood was no different. I was particularly attracted to public service and environmental justice because of my own experience growing up in a pollution-burdened concrete jungle. As a kid, I would characterize myself as obese, asthmatic, anxiety-riddled, with limited upward mobility opportunities and a lack of access to spaces like the San Gabriel Mountains. The lack of open spaces and access to public lands really compounds problems too often associated with low-income communities. The cities of Almani and South Almani are classified as top 5 disadvantaged communities in the state due to high levels of pollution, poverty, unemployment, coupled with low percentage of educational attainment and lack of park space for families. The stress of growing up in poverty, compounded with an unhealthy built environment, has created unprecedented levels of trauma for young people and families. It wasn't until my adult years where a family health scare motivated me to lose more than 100 pounds through recreation and nutrition. And now I've dedicated my career to improving the lives of my community. Inspired by my parents' work ethic, I was the first to go to college in my family and now hold a master's of public health from the Claremont Colleges. A growing body of research has found that greater exposure to nature is associated with better health and well-being. As executive director of Active San Gabriel Valley, we have led hundreds of families into the San Gabriel Mountains via a family-friendly event titled The Bike Train and organized multiple community hikes. These family-friendly recreation events are coupled with education about the San Gabriel Mountains area, highlighting how they account for 30% of LA's water supply, 70% of LA County's open space, and show families how to access this local treasure. I'm proud of the work we're doing, but we cannot solve this problem alone. We need a partnership approach to engaging and educating communities, preserving open space, and creating more access to parks and recreational opportunities. The San Gabriel Mountains Foothills and Protection Act would help ensure that over 15 million people that live within the region have access to healthy recreation opportunities by preserving the last places of the San Gabriel Mountains with wilderness, wild river, national monument designations, and establishing the San Gabriel National Recreation Area, a partnership to catalyze collaboration among federal, state, and local stakeholders. Our families in the San Gabriel Valley are being suffocated by the impacts of poverty, absent nature, and the overburden of pollution. We need more opportunities to breathe clean air, recreate, and coexist with our families and nature. I wholeheartedly believe this legislation will provide families with an opportunity to breathe clean air, recreate in nature, and create forever memories with their loved ones. Thank you again for hearing us today and the committee for the opportunity to testify before you today to address this important bill that would increase recreational access, but also mental health and well-being for park-poor and pollution-burdened communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Collard, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Family and the thousands of former campers and staff who've attended a session of summer camp at the Bar 717 Ranch. I thank you for your consideration of H.R. 2250, the Northwest California Wilderness, Recreation, and Working Forests Act. I appreciate the chance to appear before you today, my one voice in place of the many who support this bill, knowing the benefits it will bring to the forests, wildlife, people, and the communities of Northwestern California. To put in context my support for the bill, I want to tell you a story about my family and how we came to Trinity County and the land that informs our views and our support for H.R. 2250. 120 years ago, my great-grandparents, Delia and Alfred Gates, moved their family from Wyoming to California, seeking land upon which to raise a growing family. 17 miles down the trail from the tiny town of Hayfork, a day's ride on horseback back then, they found what they were looking for: 160 acres of fir and pine forests with a few big meadows, graced with good southern exposure and ringed with ancient white oaks. 3 years after settling on their new homestead, the surrounding 1.2 million acres became the Trinity Forest Reserve. It was my grandfather's childhood in those forests and along those wild rivers that formed the core philosophy for the summer camp he founded in 1930. I had the great good fortune to follow in his footsteps. And if I had one wish, it would be this: grant every child these same opportunities, protect these wild places, and allow children to build multi-generational relationships with nature. Make sure everyone can explore these forests and can swim in the clear waters of Hayfork Creek on a hot summer afternoon. Now more than ever, in a world of screens, smartphones, social media, being immersed in the natural world is a vital experience for every child, a keystone to building self-esteem, self-confidence, and a greater understanding of our species' place in nature. Advance this bill, and you'll provide more of these life-changing opportunities for future generations of American children. The best thing we can do for these lands, for businesses like mine that depend on untrammeled tracts of wilderness, is to protect them. I like to say that our family business is helping families raise blue ribbon citizens. For the past 90 years, the Bar 717 Ranch has welcomed children to our 450-acre summer camp in the beautiful mountains of Trinity County to experience nature, form deep friendships, and have big fun. Like many other businesses in this area, ours is fueled by people seeking to experience the wild beauty of Trinity County. Our business is recreation, and recreation is a growing industry in California as the population increases and urbanizes. H.R. 2250 recognizes and promotes economic opportunities that recreation presents to our rural communities. We need wilderness, clean flowing rivers, trails, and healthy forests to sustain our business, just as we need economic development in our communities for our employees and their families to thrive. In Trinity County, I know there's broad support for this bill. I'm pleased there's no formal opposition from our elected boards. But because wilderness designations are often opposed by those associated with mining and timber interests, or by those who incorrectly perceive it as a form of increased government control, I also know some individuals in Trinity County will oppose this bill. Surprisingly, while we can all agree that what makes this region special is the natural beauty of its wild lands, not everyone believes these landscapes, forests, and waterways should be protected from development or damage. The notion that extractive land use practices such as mining or logging will be adequate to underpin the local economy in the future is myopically nostalgic. H.R. 2250 understands that recreation and restoration are the future. Thank you for your invitation before the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. I'm honored by the opportunity you've given me to share my views and to express support on behalf of so many in our community who urge you to pass the Northwest California Wilderness Recreation and Working Forests Act.
Thank you, Mr. Collard. Supervisor Groves, I mentioned in my earlier introduction that both of you were from beautiful parts of Trinity County. I don't mean to imply that there's any part of Trinity County that's not beautiful. The fact is the whole place is beautiful. But I should have also mentioned that you are one of the top winemakers in Trinity County at Alpine Cellars. So let us get that product placement message into the introduction. And with that, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman, and I'm sure the three people watching that product placement will be wonderful. Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Keith Groves, and I am a District 1 Supervisor from Trinity County. I'm a lifelong resident of the county, and my family has been there almost 100 years. First off, I want to thank Congressman Huffman for presenting a wilderness bill that contained forest management. We have seen a lack of management in the forest, especially by the Forest Service, for over 30 years. And so that is a definite step forward.
Trinity County has a population of about 13,000 people. Our county works with a discretionary budget of $8 million. And the county is just over 2 million acres, and 1.5 million acres of it, or 76%, is controlled by the federal government. Currently, within the county, we have 520,000 acres of wilderness, which is about 25% of our county, and if this bill passed as is, it would increase the number to 770,000 acres, or approximately 37% of our county. At that point, the Trinity Wilderness would total 1.5% of the wilderness in the continental United States, and to the former speaker from Minnesota, we would challenge them for the 14th highest ranked spot if we were a state in the nation. Also in this bill, we have 730,000 acres, more acres moved to restoration area. And how much of that is in our county is unclear, but it's clearly the vast majority of that number. On July 2nd, the Board of Supervisors decided in a 4-1 vote to move to a neutral stand on H.R. 2250. This decision was made in a large part due to the lack of information and understanding of the bill by the board as a whole. The board has many questions that are unknown to them, so I think that's already been done, is contacted Congressman Huffman and is requesting a workshop-style meeting in front of the public and the board to work out any confusions the board may have. In my written testimony, I gave a list of questions for the congressman when he hopefully can make it out to us when possible. I think what's important to get from these questions, I don't need to go through them, is that all these clarification questions are not about the wilderness, the proposed 250,000 acres, or the proposed scenic waters part. It's all questions about what happens in the restoration area. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and me and the supervisors together, and we look forward to interactions with Congressman and the committee.
Thank you, Supervisor Groves. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I want to start by pointing out that the Republican minority did invite you, Supervisor Groves, I'm sure because you've been publicly critical of the bill, but I'm not giving up even on winning your support for this bill, and you've said elsewhere that you're 90% in agreement with it. So let's keep working on that 10%. I'm certainly not going to give up, and you'll see me later this month in Trinity County for that deep dive with your board and with other stakeholders, which I genuinely look forward to. Also want to mention that there's actually 2 Trinity County supervisors in the room today. Supervisor Jeremy Brown is immediately behind you. His district is one which actually contains some of the wilderness proposed in this bill, and he's a supporter of the bill. So there's a lot of support in Trinity County, as well as some questions and some concerns that we want to continue to work through. And I'd just like to request unanimous consent to enter a letter into the record from the chair of the Board of Supervisors, Judy Morris, explaining that the board at this time does indeed have a neutral position on the bill. But again, I'm committed to trying to move that neutral in the direction of support. At least you'll see a great effort on my part to do that. Now, Mr. Collard, you've got a direct connection to some of the remote and spectacular lands and streams that are proposed for protection in this bill. I want to note that existing mining and grazing is not impacted by this bill, but future resource use of that nature would be prohibited in the wilderness areas. While existing water rights are not implicated, future development of water rights on wild and scenic river designated areas would be prohibited. Why is it important to you that these places be permanently protected? And can you explain why they are frankly not likely to be mined or logged or extracted in the future anyway, by virtue of how remote and pristine they are?
I think a part of why they wouldn't be developed or mined or logged in the future is just that they are remote and they're rugged and they're unroaded, and that's the best thing about them, is that they're hard to get to. And I think had there been something of value there in the last 150 years, somebody would have found it. And so I think at this point, the highest and best use for them is to keep them in the condition they are. People come for recreation to Trinity County. People come for the Alps and the other huge tracts of undeveloped land, and they want to hike and fish and hunt and ride their horses, and these are the places that you can do that.
Yeah, you alluded in your testimony to the outdoor recreation economy, and I want to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that, how your business is directly tied to healthy wild public lands and waters and all of the recreational activity that goes along with that. And also, if you could speak to how outdoor recreation supports the local economy in Trinity County, which is important. Trinity County economically has been struggling for a long, long time. So speak to what that means, the opportunity to protect these places in a way that supports outdoor recreation.
Yeah, well, I think I can speak to two things. One, in our corner of the county, we're on the western edge in a very small town, High and Palm, and our business contributes about $500,000 in payroll to employees that work the season from June to September in our business. And then in other parts of the county, there's whitewater rafting, there's the Trinity Alps, there's guide services that take people on, rafting trips or up into the Alps. I know there's citizens or active members in Weaverville that have been trying to bring more mountain biking and other outdoor recreation to the county, and they've been doing a great job of it. People want to come. They want to experience these places, and so preserving them is important.
So fire protection is also something we've really prioritized in this bill with shaded fuel breaks and better planning and coordination. Trinity County is a place that's directly impacted by the growing frequency and severity of wildfires. Can you speak to how these strategies would make a difference on the ground in Trinity County?
Yeah, we need a proactive approach to fire. We have not had that, and I'd say a significant portion of the county has burned in the last 15 years. Certainly, right up to our property lines, and so proposals to create shaded fuel breaks, to treat the forest or make other efforts to reduce the fire risk. Prescribed fire is one that we're talking a lot about, at least in our local fire safe council at High and Palm, are really important. We have to get ahead of the inevitable fact that the forest is going to burn. It's a part of the ecology up there. It's natural. There's nothing wrong with it. But the impacts from smoke in particular to our business and other residents and businesses is really it's significant. It really is a big economic impact when people can't come because of the smoke, and so we need to get ahead of it.
All right, thank you very much. The chair, is Mr. Lowenthal next? The chair now recognizes Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to begin by thanking you and Representative Chu and the very thoughtful colleague to my left here, just on the dais, not politically, Representative Carbajal, for introducing their respective bills to protect important areas within California. As we all know, California is a beautiful place. It has the highest point in the lower 48 in the nation. It also has the lowest point in all of North America. It has the world's tallest, oldest, biggest trees. Because of this, there are areas within our state, such as the San Gabriel Mountains and the Trinity Alps, that if they were in any other state, they would have been granted by now, certainly, national park protection generations ago. But because they're in the same state as Death Valley, Joshua Tree, Kings Canyon, Redwood, Yosemite, just to name a few, these areas have to wait for protection that they deserve. And that's, again, why I'm so pleased that my colleagues have introduced this very important legislation. And California is a huge state in terms of population. So I want to talk to Mr. Diaz first. You know, in your testimony, you briefly mentioned how the stress of poverty compounded with an unhealthy built environment has created unprecedented levels of trauma and mental health issues for young people. You also talked about public health, or just health itself. So my question is, since much of these both mental health and public health, are due to the lack of open spaces and public lands in the region, can you speak to the benefits that open spaces and increased public lands also provide to communities? What are the benefits in terms of mental health and public health?
Yes, thank you for your question, Mr. Lowenthal. As mentioned, one of the ways that I was able to transform my life was through the adoption of a healthy lifestyle, which was mostly led by recreation and nutrition. I think, in particular, as it relates to the cities of South El Monte and El Monte, as referenced, to give you perspective, it's about 0.33 to 0.41 acres per 1,000 residents of available park space in these communities. And so, accounting that the San Gabriel Mountains are about 70% of LA County's open space and have been severely underfunded and under-resourced, the potential for families and young people to actually be able to access public lands is going to be tremendous. I also mentioned that I am currently an elected official for the El Monte Unified School District Board of Trustees. I'm trying to find you over here. And so what we've seen is unprecedented levels of trauma and stress for children, young people, that have resulted in various things from ongoing anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and most of that has been compounded by the lack of resources in that local community to be able to support young people. Someone mentioned our attachment to social media and technology now. You know, the protection and expansion of a national recreation area and the San Gabriel National Monument would just be able to provide families with an opportunity to get away from all that. There's really a concrete jungle and absence of nature and clean air in our communities right now. So the impact of having access to public lands would be tremendous.
Thank you. Mr. Collard, can you briefly describe how greater public land protection support outdoor recreation and local economies? Can you you've already described a little bit, but can you talk to us a little bit about how this is really a driver of the economy?
Sure. People come to Trinity County for access to these lands, to be able to hike and backpack, fish, and ride horses. So they stay in local motels. They rent our facility. They camp in the campground, spend their money in grocery stores. So there's a big impact locally. People coming.
Thank you, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mr. Carbajal from a part of the California coast that's almost as beautiful as my district for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Certainly you haven't made enough visits to my area, but I'm sure you will be coming there more. For the record, we're both gauchos, graduates of UCSB in the area. First, I want to thank Ms. Cabello for making the trek and coming here to testify to the House Natural Resource Committee and to testify in support of H.R. 2199, the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act. I'm proud of the work we've done on this legislation, the work we've done with the community to garner support. I earlier testified before this committee as to the different components of this important legislation. Ms. Cabello, can you explain further on the benefits wilderness designations would provide to the public? And two, would you be able to elaborate further on the type of community support that exists for this legislation?
Sure. The bill currently would designate the Condor Trail as a national scenic trail, which it would expand from LA County to Monterey County, and that's about 400 miles. That would put us on the map right up there with the Pacific Crest Trail and the Appalachian Trail, and it would also help funnel resources to more trail maintenance in the area, which is highly needed. Another thing that it would do is actually provide more habitat for the condor, which is an endangered species in California, and it's the iconic condor. And another thing actually is just provide a place to, have more outdoor education opportunities. I connect youth to the forest, and a lot of them have never seen any wildlife up close. And so they can go to a museum, they can do all of those things, read about them in the textbook, but until they're actually able to witness a condor with their own eyes, or even things like bobcats, they don't really begin to understand the impact that they have on the landscape. In terms of the support that it has, it currently benefits from multiple stakeholders, everything from elected officials to business owners, recreational groups, conservationists. It is essentially unopposed. So there is no opposition for the bill. Any opposition that exists is not based on a genuine grievance. It's more philosophical. So there is a lot of support. The wilderness areas that are proposed in the bill are all in Santa Barbara County, and the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors voted 5-0 on a resolution for it.
Thank you. I think that speaks as to the broad support that this legislation has in our region. And I think it's just a great initiative to move conservation forward for future generations, not only for the area, but beyond our region, for those other Californians and other members throughout our nation, residents who want to come and enjoy this pristine open space and all the values and benefits that it provides. Thank you.
Can I add one more thing? It's important to note that the area around the Los Padres National Forest currently generates $24 million in revenue for the surrounding communities. So adding the designated wilderness would only add an economic boost to that area, which is really important as well.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cabello. Mr. Diaz, I wanted to ask you, could you touch on a little bit of the value that these type of open spaces provide for urban populations, in particular low-income communities?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I started my career as a youth organizer for a nonprofit organization, and we would take hikes with youth, and now those young people have graduated high school, have gone off to college, but we still keep in touch. And so I'm able to see them be successful and thrive, via social media, funny enough, but they're on an often basis going off and recreating in nature. So really, these public lands provide ongoing opportunities for families to really connect and belong with each other. As mentioned in my statement, people are suffocating from the lack of clean air in our communities. Indoor, outdoor, it's all bad air quality. This gives them an opportunity to breathe clean air for a short period of time, to be able to coexist y convivir with their family.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the witnesses who came here today. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carbajal, and I too want to thank all of the witnesses, many of whom have traveled a long way to be with us. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we will ask them to submit those in writing, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must do that within 3 business days following this hearing, and then the hearing record will be held open for 10 more business days to allow for responses. If there's no further business before the committee, we stand adjourned. Thank you.
does your day look like for the rest of the day? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.